15. A drunk like you. The more he listened in at meetings, the more he came to know about his own drinking history. Usually, our stories start out by telling what we were like, what happened, and what we are like now. For me, what it was like was nothing in particular. No problems. Nothing special happened. Nothing that I realized, anyhow. Only much later, when I started listening to the other people and what happened to them, and when and how did I realize that those things were in my past also. My story starts in the middle. What happened? My family and I were attending a relative's breeze, a Jewish ritual circumcision, and a baby naming ceremony. After the ceremonies and brunch, I fell asleep. When it was time to leave, they woke me up. The car ride home was very quiet. The wife and my two kids said nothing. Later that day, I found out what the problem really was. When they came to wake me up, I was very belligerent and threatening. I scared them. They were afraid I would hit them. That was it. I could see something had to be done. My wife's sister-in-law, who is a social worker, suggested that we see a counselor. I thought it might be a good idea. I was having anxiety attacks for no reason. I used to be able to demonstrate products to high-level executives of the corporation I worked for with no problem. Now, even minor product showcases were becoming difficult. Also, I was having trouble getting good technicians to work for me. In the past, I had to pick because I was good to work with for the projects, and the projects were fun, with interesting new ideas. I always had a quick temper, but now things were getting out of hand. I would do things like beat up my desk with my desk chair. And the most serious thing to me was that I was contemplating suicide. I had an actual plan. A plan for an accident that would raise no question in the minds of the insurance company. So, in a moment of sanity, I decided it would be a good idea to seek help. If I hadn't lost my marbles, they were at the very least loose. So my wife and I found a psychiatric social worker at the local Jewish Family Services Agency. She saw us as a couple, then individually, then together, and so it went. When we were together, we worked on our interpersonal problems. When I saw her by myself, she would talk about drinking. I don't know why she kept bringing it up. I mean, I drank, but I didn't drink that much. I never even mentioned my drinking, except maybe to say, yes, I do drink. When she asked, it wasn't the problem. The other things were. One day, she read me some questions from a pamphlet, which I answered honestly. She concluded that maybe I drank too much, and we talked about that for several sessions. One day, she asked if I could limit myself to 5 drinks in a day. I said, sure. Was I surprised when I found that I couldn't? That should have been my first clue that she might be right, but it didn't occur to me. Then I hit on a clever solution. I have several academic degrees, and someone as smart as I could see the problem. The idea was to put off the first drink as long as possible and go to bed after the last drink. That worked out okay, and I told the counselor I was able to keep it to 5 a day with little or no problem. But she said, if you have to control something, it's already out of control. During one session, she suggested that I try not drinking at all one weekend. All right, I said. She also suggested that I send the kids off somewhere for the weekend because I might be irritable. I used to watch a lot of late night movies. It was my time to relax by having a few drinks, a habit that started in night school when I had a full-time job and was studying chemistry at night. I had seen movie versions of what happened to people who had drinking problems. The Lost Weekend, Days of Wine and Roses, and others. And so, I was nervous about raging, losing control, and maybe being violent, as my wife had said I was. So we packed up the kids and the booze and took all to my wife's parents. Much to my surprise, the weekend went well. No problems. And in the next session, I told my counselor so. She said, what about the meeting? I said, what meeting? She said, the AA meeting. I said, what AA meeting? We never talked about that. She said I had agreed to go to an AA meeting. So out came a list of meetings. She explained about open and closed meetings. I decided on one I thought would be okay for me. A men's discussion group. They would be my kind of people, and the time fit into my schedule. The meeting list started on Sunday. I never start a project or anything else on a Sunday. Monday was my MASH night. Tuesday was Tuesday night at the movies. And I'm a big old movie fan. So Wednesday is when I decided to try this AA meeting. The meeting went okay. We talked about somebody's problem with an anonymity break at his doctor's office. The people at the meeting were telling him stuff that made no sense. Like, live and let live. Easy does it. One day at a time. Use the serenity prayer. Talk to your sponsor. And as we went around the table, it came my turn. Since they were all saying they were alcoholics, it wasn't too hard for me to say my name and, hi, I'm an alcoholic, and suggest that the man should just go to another doctor. He thanked me very much, and after the meeting, he said to be sure and come back next week. During the meeting, somebody mentioned spending too much time at discussion tables when we should have been spending more time at first step tables for newcomers. So I went to the first step table the following week. The discussion was very interesting. I didn't think I was powerless over the alcohol, but I did know my life had become unmanageable. One night we were talking about when we started drinking, and I was saying that I drank all my life. Actually, I was given my first drink at my breeze. That it usually done when a boy is 8 days old. So I said all Jewish boys start drinking early. I had to admit that after that, it was just the usual milk and juice until I could sit up at the table with the family, and then there would be Kiddush wine every Friday night. Not great stuff. What we got was sweet wine and seltzer. So I didn't drink very much of it. I didn't like it. Later, I learned the definition of a social drinker: someone who can take it or leave it. When I was about 10 years old, we all came back from my cousin's bar mitzvah services to celebrate at my grandmother's house. There, I had my first real drink. All the adults went over to the table for some schnapps. There were all these little tiny glasses in front of various liquor bottles, and everyone was having one. So I had one too. It was good. It was smooth, it was warm, and it was wonderful. I liked it and went back for another. This one wasn't as smooth. It was hot going down, not as wonderful. After that, I drank what I could, when I could, and where I could. Not much, not often, not as a 10-year-old. And that first step, we figured out, or they did anyhow, that was alcoholic drinking. Having one and going back for a second right away. I know now I never had just one drink ever. One night, they were talking about how much they drank, and one guy said he had so many beers. The next guy was talking about shots, and another about mixed drinks I had never heard of. Another so many pints, and on it went around the table. When my turn came, I said, I didn't know. Wow, that much, they said. No, I said. I bet I didn't know the amount. I drank mostly at home and poured some in a tall glass. I drank that and did refill it several times. Well, how many times did you refill? I don't know. Somebody asked me it another way. He wanted to know how many I bought. Well, I said, I'd stopped in the package store each day and bought one. Oh, he said, how many did you have at the end of the week? Well, he had me there. None, I said. He said, a bottle a day, man. I never got to say another word. It was settled over my objections. I saw the counselor once a week, and I went to the men's meeting once a week, and everything was getting better. One day, I saw somebody get a 90-day pin. I decided not to get one, even though I couldn't see it from where I was sitting. I wasn't going to wear an AA sign. One day, somebody got a 90-day pocket piece that he could rub for luck, and I decided to get one of those. After my 3 months were up, I went to the literature guy and bought me one. He said it would be nice if it was presented to me in front of everybody. I wasn't too keen on getting up in front of everyone. He said it'd be good for the newcomers. It would show them that this program really works. So I told him okay and asked the leader of the first step to give it to me. They were paying him to run the meeting, or so I thought at the time. Later, I found out that they were reimbursing him for the snacks. So the following week, I got my pocket piece and thanked everybody for giving me power over alcohol. Now I was more powerful than alcohol because for the first time in a long time, I could choose not to use it. A couple of weeks later, the large company I was with, which had relocated me and my family at their expense, had a large staff cutback, and I was cut back. Fired! I thought I was fireproof. I was in a very important position, doing very important work. I was the chief researcher in developing a new product. I was sitting in on strategic planning meetings. I was very upset. After all, I was better now and back to being a good employee and a team player. But to no avail. We were able to stay on site in special offices set aside for us to conduct our job search. As part of this job search, I was allowed to go on a professional convention being held in the Southwest. Now, somehow, between the time I lost my job and my flight to the convention, I decided maybe I wasn't an alcoholic after all, and I needed to test that theory. After all, I was a researcher, and things needed to be tested. I decided that on the plane. It seemed like a safe enough place. I would put this question to the test. If I could have one drink and no more, I was not an alcoholic. Alcoholics can't do that. So when the stewardess come by to ask me if I wanted a drink, I said yes. She put 2 little bottles worth in a glass. No ice, thank you. Thank you very much. On her way back, she asked me if I wanted another. I said yes. I drank for the whole flight, before dinner, during dinner, and after dinner. As we approached our destination, I searched my pocket for a pen to fill out the in-flight magazine response card. I found this large coin. I took it out to see what it was. It was my 90-day pocket piece. And I was reminded of what I was doing. And the thought came to me, wow, those guys at the meeting were right. I am powerless over alcohol. I put that coin back in my pocket. From that day to this, some 15 and a half years later, I've had no urge to drink. When I got back to my meeting, I told them what happened. I don't know why. It was not like the old me to fess up to anything. They were concerned only whether I was still drinking, and I said, no, I'm not. I was worried that they were going to take my coin back. All they wanted to know was what I was going to do now. I had no idea. They did, however. They said I needed a sponsor. So I found a sponsor. They said I needed more meetings. How many? I wanted to know. They said I only had to go to meetings on days I would have had a drink. They said I needed to identify, not compare. I didn't know what they meant. What was the difference? Identifying, they said, was trying to see how I was like the people I was with. Comparing, they told me, was looking for differences, usually seeing how I was better than others. One day we were talking about spiritual awakenings. Everyone talked a little bit about what happened to them and when and how and all that. But then it came my turn. I said I hadn't had one yet, but I was open to it. Well, two people were trying to talk to us at the same time. What have you been telling us about the airplane flight all this time? Well, I said, I was drinking, and the coin reminded me of what I did, and I decided I was powerless, couldn't drink anymore, and stopped. One man said, Well, that's it? What more do you want? I said, What about the blinding white flash? What about it? He said, Read the big book. The appendix explains the concept of a sudden change and a gradual change, and that not everybody has the blinding white flash. Oh, I said, that was it. That was mine? Yes, I was told. What more do you want? Actually, I wanted something more dramatic, and my sponsor said what he so often did. So? And I found myself saying, Well, if that's it, it will have to do. Have to do? He replied. It was bigger and better than most, and most importantly, it worked. You stopped, and you didn't start again. Well, that worked for me. I have stayed fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous long enough to find the program in the big book and to practice all its principles in my affairs on a daily basis. The last big hurdle was closing the meeting with the Lord's Prayer. As a Jew, I was uncomfortable with it and decided to talk to my sponsor about it. So I said, The Lord's Prayer bothers me. I don't like closing with it. Oh, he said, what's the problem? Well, I'm Jewish, and it's not a Jewish prayer. Well then, he said, say it in Jewish. I said, it would still be the Lord's Prayer. Right, he said. Then say something else that you like. Your higher power, whatever you call it, is helping you, and you need to say thank you. That was a big step for me. I finally began to separate the religious aspects of my life from AA's spiritual program. Now the big difference to me is that religion is the ritual, and we all differ there. And spirituality is the way we feel about what we do. It's about my personal contact with my personal higher power, as I understand him. Everything is turned around. I found a new job, which I decided to leave. I opened my own business. I was able to put my two sons through college at large universities. My oldest son's great passion was to go on long road trips to get away from home when it was time to come home on school breaks. Now he comes home regularly and brings friends. The younger son comes home often and calls regularly. The marriage is no longer on the brink and is better than ever. The best is yet to come. All this and more I owe to the fellowship in the rooms, in the program, in the book. 16. Acceptance was the answer. The physician was not hooked, he thought. He just prescribed drugs medically indicated for his many ailments. Acceptance was his key to liberation. If there was ever anyone who came to AA by mistake, it was I. I just didn't belong here. Never in my wildest moments had it occurred to me that I might be an alcoholic. Never once had my mother even hinted at the idea that when I grew up, I might like to be president of AA. Not only did I not think that being an alcoholic was a good idea, I didn't even feel that I had all that much of a drinking problem. Of course, I had problems, all sorts of problems. If you had my problems, you'd drink too. My major problems were marital. If you'd been my wife, you'd drink too. Max and I had been married for 28 years when I ended up in AA. It started out as a good marriage, but it deteriorated over the years as she progressed through the various stages of qualifying for Al Anon. At first, she would say, "You don't love me. Why don't you admit it?" Later, she would say, "You don't like me. Why don't you admit it?" And her disease was reaching the terminal stages. She was screaming, "You hate me. You hate me. Why don't you just admit it? You hate me." So I admitted it. I remember very well saying, "There's only one person in the world whose guts I hate worse than yours, and they're my own." She cried a bit and went to bed. That was the only answer to problems that she had left. I cried a bit, then mixed myself another drink. Today, we don't have to live like that anymore. Max hadn't gotten that way because I didn't care. Indeed, it seemed that I cared too much. I had sent her to 4 consecutive psychiatrists, and not one of them had gotten me sober. I also had to send my kids to psychiatrists. I remember one time even the dog had a psychiatric diagnosis. I yelled at Max, "What do you mean the dog just needs more love? You tell that dumb dog and cat doctor he's not no Beverly Hills psychiatrist. All I want to know is why does that dog wet in my lap every time I hold him? That dog has not wet my pants since I joined AA, and neither have I." The harder I worked with Max, the sicker she got. So, when it ended up at a psycho ward, I wasn't all that surprised. But then, when that steel door slammed shut and she was the one that went home, I was truly amazed. I had begun to drink in the early years of pharmacy school in order to get some sleep. After going to school all day, working in the family drugstore all evening, and then studying until 1 or 2 in the morning, I would not be able to sleep soundly. With everything I had been studying going round in my head, I would be half asleep and half awake, and in the morning I would be both tired and stupid. Then I found the solution. At the end of study time, I would drink 2 beers, jump into bed, sleep real fast, wake up real smart. I drank my way through schools and always got honors. And as I went through pharmacy school, graduate school, medical school, internship, residency, and specialty training, and finally went into practice, my drinking kept increasing. But I thought It was because my responsibilities were increasing. If you had my responsibilities, if you needed to sleep like I do, you'd drink too. My drinking took place after work hours. I remember finding myself in the middle of the night in the doctor's parking lot at a hospital, with one foot in the car and one foot on the ground, not knowing which was the lead foot, finding myself hanging up the telephone, then realizing I had gotten out of bed, answered the phone, turned on the light, and carried on a conversation with the patient. I didn't know whether I'd told him to rush to the hospital and I'd meet him there, or to take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. With a problem like that, I couldn't go back to sleep. So I'd sit up and watch old Wallace Beery movies all night on TV and drink. The longer the drinking continued, the shorter the time the alcohol would keep me asleep. I would have to drink myself back to sleep again and again throughout the night. But I never became a morning drinker. Instead, I had a 5 a.m. shut-off time. If it was 1 minute before 5, I'd drink myself back to sleep. If it was 1 minute after, I'd stay up and act like a martyr all day. It became progressively harder to get up in the morning until one day I asked myself what I would do for a patient who felt this rotten. The answer came right back. I'd give him something to pep him up. So I immediately started taking and shooting pep pills. Eventually, I was taking 45 milligrams of the long-acting Benzedrine and 45 of the short-acting just to get out of bed in the morning. I took more through the day to increase the high, and more to maintain it. When I overshot the mark, I'd take my tranquilizers to level off. The pep pills affected my hearing at times. I couldn't listen fast enough to hear what I was saying. I'd think, I wonder why I'm saying that again. I've already said it 3 times. Still, I couldn't turn my mouth off. For the leveling off process, I just loved intravenous Demerol. But I found it hard to practice good medicine while shooting morphine. Following an injection, I would have to keep one hand busy, scratching my constantly itching nose, and would also have sudden, uncontrollable urges to vomit. I never got much effect out of codeine and Percodan and the tranquilizers. However, for a period of time I was injecting pentothal intravenously to put myself to sleep. That's the stuff used when the oral surgeon puts the needle in your vein and says count to 10, and before you get to 2, you're asleep. Constant blackout was what it was like, and it seemed delightful. I didn't feel. I could lie in bed and squirt the stuff in my veins while my kids and wife stood around watching me. So I kept the drugs in my bag, and the bag in the car, and the car in the garage. Luckily, the garage was attached to the house. In the garage, I would put the needle in my vein and then try to figure out exactly how much medication to inject to overcome the pep pills, while adding to the sleeping pills while ignoring the tranquilizers, in order to get just enough to be able to pull out the needle, jerk the tourniquet, throw it in the car, slam the car door shut, run down the hall, and fall into bed before I fell asleep. It was hard to judge the right amount. One night, I had to put myself back to sleep 3 times, and I had finally decided to give it up. But to do so, I had to get all the stuff out of the house and out of my possession. In the end, I had to do the same with alcohol and all pills. I wasn't able to quit the chemicals as long as they were in the house. If they were around, I always found a need for them, especially the pills. I never in my life took a tranquilizer, sedative, or pep pill because I was a pillhead. I always took it because I had the symptom that only that pill would relieve. Therefore, every pill was medically indicated at the time it was taken. For me, pills don't produce the desire to swallow a pill. They produce the symptoms that require the pill to be taken for relief. As a physician and pharmacist who had grown up in a drugstore home, I had a pill for every ill. I was sick a lot. Today, I find I can't work my AA program while taking pills, nor may I even have them around me for dire emergencies only. I can't say that I will be done and take a pill. I can't say I'm powerless over alcohol, but solid alcohol is okay. I can't say God could restore me to sanity, but until He does, I'll control myself with pills. Giving up alcohol alone was simply not enough. I had to give up all mood and mind affecting chemicals in order to stay sober and comfortable. On 2 occasions over weekends, I had decided I would take absolutely nothing. On each occasion, I had a convulsion on Sunday morning. Both times, my reaction was that I had nothing to drink the night before, so obviously the alcohol had nothing to do with it. The neurologist in charge of my case didn't think to tell me or ask whether I drank, and I didn't think to tell him. As a result, he could not figure out why I had the convulsions. And he decided to send me to the Mayo Clinic. It seemed to me I needed a consultation first. I happened to be the best diagnostician I knew at the time, and certainly I knew my case better than anyone. So I sat down with me and went over the facts behind the convulsions, personality changes, daily headaches, sense of impending doom, sense of impending insanity. Suddenly, it was obvious to me I had a brain tumor and would die, and everyone would be so sorry for me. The Mayo Clinic seemed like a good place to have my diagnosis confirmed. After 9 days of tests at Mayo, I was put in the locked ward of all places. That's when that steel door slammed shut, and Max was the one who went home. I didn't like being on the nut ward, and I particularly didn't like being forced to ice cookies on Christmas Eve. So I raised enough fuss that they finally agreed to let me sign out against medical advice. Max accepted responsibility for me after I had promised never to drink again, never to take another pill, never to swear again, and never to talk to girls ever again. We got on the plane, and immediately a big fight, whether over I'd drink the free booze. Max won. I did not drink it, but by God, I wouldn't talk or eat either. And that was how Max and I and our two daughters spent Christmas Day 8 years ago. When we got home, I got a bottle of scotch and went to bed. The next day, Max called the neurologist and told him about the myopsychiatrist's opinion. He arranged for me to see a local psychiatrist who quickly decided I should be in the mental health unit of a local hospital. The people there insisted on putting me in the ward when Max and I both knew I ought to have a private room. Finally, she asked, "Do you realize he's on the staff of this hospital?" And I got my private room. Time went by very, very slowly on my second nut ward, and I could quite get the knack of it and kept asking myself, what's a nice guy like me doing in a place like this? They just wanted me to make leather belts, of all things. Had I gone to school all those years just to sit and make leather belts? Besides, I couldn't understand the instructions. The girl had explained them to me 4 times, and I was too embarrassed to ask her again. I am pleased to state, however, that I had gone to only a few AA meetings before I was able to make a really beautiful pair of moccasins and half of a wallet. I wore those moccasins every night for the next 7 years, till they wore out. For my 7th AA birthday, my program-oriented, Al-Anon wife had my moccasins bronzed. Now I own perhaps the most costly pair of moccasins anyone has ever seen, and they help me remember where I've been. In the hospital, I hung on to the idea I'd had most of my life, that if I could just control the external environment, the internal environment would then become comfortable. Much of my time was spent writing letters, notes, orders, and lists of things for Max, who was also my office nurse, to do to keep the world running while I was locked up. One has to be pretty sick to do that, and perhaps one has to be even sicker to come back every day for a new list, as she did. Today, we don't have to live that way. Max still works with me in the office, but we have turned our wills and our lives and our work over to the care of God, each with the other as a witness. We took the third step out loud, just as it says in the big book, and life keeps getting simpler and easier as we try to reverse my old idea. By taking care of the internal environment via the 12 steps and letting the external environment take care of itself. One day, as I sat there in the hospital, my psychiatrist walked up to me from behind and asked, "How'd you like to talk to the man from AA?" My reaction was that I'd already helped all of the patients on the ward, and I still had plenty of problems of my own without trying to help some drunk from AA. But by the look on the psychiatrist's face, I could tell that it would really make him happy if I agreed. So, for no better reason than to make him happy, I agreed. Very shortly I realized that had been a mistake. This big clown come bounding into the room, almost shouting, "My name is Frank, and I'm an alcoholic. Ha ha ha!" I really felt sorry for him. The only thing in life he had to brag about was the fact he was an alcoholic. It wasn't until later that he told me he was an attorney. Against my better judgment, I went to a meeting with him that night, and a strange thing began to happen. The psychiatrist who had generally been ignoring me now became quite interested. Every day he would ask me all kinds of questions about the AA meetings. At first, I wondered whether he was an alcoholic himself, and he was sending me to find out about AA. But it quickly became obvious that he had this childish notion instead. If he could get me to go to enough meetings while in the hospital, I would continue to go after he let me out. So, for no better reason than to fool him, I asked Frank to take me for a meeting each night. And Frank did set me up for a meeting every night except Friday, when he thought that he might have a date with his girlfriend. That's a devil of a way to run an organization, I thought, and I reported Frank to the psychiatrist, who didn't seem perturbed. He just got someone else to take me on Fridays. Eventually, the psychiatrist discharged me from the hospital, and Max and I began going to meetings ourselves. Right from the start, I felt that they weren't doing anything for me, but they sure were helping Max. We sat in the back and talked only to each other. It was precisely a year before I spoke at an AA meeting. Although we enjoyed the laughter in the early days, I heard a lot of things that I thought were stupid. I interpreted sober as meaning drinking, but not being drunk. When a big, healthy looking young fellow stood up there and said, "I'm a success today if I don't drink today," I thought, man, I've got 1,000 things to do today before I can brag about not taking a drink, for God's sake. Of course, I was still drinking at the time. There is absolutely nothing in the world more important to me today than keeping this alcoholic sober. Not taking a drink is by far the most important thing I do each day. It seemed that they all talked about meetings, drinking, drinking, drinking. It made me thirsty. I wanted to talk about my many big problems. Drinking seemed a small one, and I knew that giving up one drink for one day wouldn't really do it any good. Finally, after 7 months, I decided to try it. To this day, I'm amazed at how many of my problems, most of which had nothing to do with drinking, I believed, have become quite manageable or simply disappeared since I quit drinking. I had already given up on the narcotics, most of the pills, and some of the alcohol when I first came to AA. By early July 1st, I had tapered off of the alcohol completely, and I got off all the pills in the ensuing few months. When the compulsion to drink left, it was relatively easy to stay off alcohol, but for some time it was difficult to keep from taking a pill when I had an appropriate symptom, such as a cough, pain, anxiety, insomnia. a muscle spasm, or even an upset stomach. It has gotten progressively easier. Today, I feel I've used up my right to chemical peace of mind. It helped me a great deal to become convinced that alcoholism was a disease, not a moral issue. I had been drinking as a result of compulsion, even though I had not been aware of the compulsion at the time, and that sobriety was not a matter of willpower. The people of AA had something that looked much better than what I had, but I was afraid to let go of what I had in order to try something new. There was a certain sense of security in the familiar. At last, acceptance proved to be the key to my drinking problem. After I'd been around AA for 7 months, tapering off alcohol and pills, not finding the program working very well, I was finally able to say, "Okay, God, it is true that I, of all people, strange as it may seem, and even though I didn't give my permission, really, really am an alcoholic of sorts. And it's all right with me. Now, what am I going to do about it?" When I stopped living in the problem and began living in the answer, the problem went away. From that moment on, I have not had a single compulsion to drink. And acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. When I am disturbed, it is because I find some person, place, thing, or situation, some fact of my life, unacceptable to me, and I can find no serenity until that person, place, or thing, or situation as being exactly the way it is supposed to be at this moment. Nothing, absolutely nothing, happens in God's world by mistake. Until I could accept my alcoholism, I could not stay sober. Unless I accept life completely on life's terms, I can't be happy. I need to concentrate not so much on what needs to be changed in the world as on what needs to be changed in me and in my attitudes. Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." He forgot to mention that I was the chief critic. I was always able to see the flaw in every person, every situation, and I was always glad to point it out, because I knew you wanted perfection, just as I did. AA and acceptance have taught me that there is a bit of good in the worst of us and a bit of bad in the best of us, that we are all children of God and each have a right to be here. When I complain about me or you, I am complaining about God's handiwork. I am saying that I know better than God. For years, I was sure the worst thing that could happen to a nice guy like me would be that I would turn out to be an alcoholic. Today, I find it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. This proves I don't know what's good for me. And if I don't know what's good for me, then I don't know what's good or bad for you or anyone. So I'm better off if I just don't give advice. Don't figure out I know what's best, and just accept life on life's terms as it is today, especially my own life as it actually is. Before AA, I judged myself by my intentions. Well, the world was judging me by my actions. Acceptance has been the answer to my marital problems. It is as though AA had been giving me a new pair of glasses. Max and I have been married now for 35 years. Prior to our marriage, when she was a shy, scrawny adolescent, I was able to see things in her that others couldn't necessarily see. Things like beauty, charm, gaiety, a gift for being easy to talk to, a sense of humor, and many other fine qualities. It was as if I had, rather, a Midas touch which turned everything to gold, a magnifying mind that magnified whatever it focused on. Over the years, as I thought about Max, her good qualities grew and grew, and we married, and all these qualities became more and more apparent to me, and we were happier and happier. But then, as I drank more and more, the alcohol seemed to affect my vision. Instead of continuing to see what was good about my wife, I began to see her defects, and the more I focused my mind on her defects, the more they grew and multiplied. Every defect I pointed out to her was greater and greater. Each time I told her she was a nothing, she receded a little more into nowhere. The more I drank, the more she wilted. Then, one day in AA, I was told that I had the lenses in my glasses backwards. The courage to change in the serenity prayer meant that I should not change my marriage, but rather that I should change myself and learn to accept my spouse as she was. AA has given me a new pair of glasses. I can again focus on my wife's good qualities and watch them grow and grow and grow. I can do the same thing in an AA meeting. The more I focus my mind on its defects, late start, long junk of logs, cigarette smoke, the worse the meeting becomes. But when I try to see what I can add to the meeting rather than what I can get out of it, and when I focus my mind on what's good about it rather than what's bad with it, the meeting keeps getting better and better. When I focus on what's good today, I have a good day. When I focus on what's bad today, I have a bad day. If I focus on a problem, the problem increases. If I focus on the answer increases. Today, Max and I try to communicate what we feel rather than what we think. We used to argue about our differing ideas, but we can't argue about our feelings. I can tell. She ought not to think a certain way, but I certainly can't take away her right to feel however she does feel. When we deal in feelings, we tend to come to know ourselves and each other much better. It hasn't been easy to work out this relationship with Max. On the contrary, the hardest place to work this program has been in my own home, with my children and finally with Max. It seems I should have learned to love my wife and family first. The newcomer to AA at last. But it was the other way around. Eventually, I had to redo each of the 12 steps specifically with Max in mind. From the first saying, I am powerless over alcohol, and my home life is unmanageable by me, to the 12th, in which I try to think of her as a sick Al Anon and treat her with love. I would give a sick AA newcomer. When I do this, we get along fine. Perhaps the best thing of all for me is to remember that my serenity is inversely proportional to my expectations. The higher my expectations of Max and other people are, the lower is my serenity. I can watch my serenity level rise when I discard my expectations. But then my rights try to move in, and they too can force my serenity level down. I have to discard my rights as well as my expectations by asking myself, how important is it really? How important is it compared to my serenity and my emotional sobriety? And when I place more value on my serenity and sobriety than on anything else, I can maintain them at a higher level, at least for the time being. Acceptance is the key to my relationship with God today. I never just sit and do nothing while waiting for Him to tell me what to do. Rather, I do whatever is in front of me to be done, and I leave the results up to Him, however it turns out. That's God's will for me. I must keep my magic magnifying mind on my acceptance and off of my expectations, for my serenity is directly proportional to my level of acceptance. When I remember this, I can see I've never had it so good. Thank God for AA. Chapter 17, Window of Opportunity. This young alcoholic stepped out a second-story window and into AA. I got sober while I was still in college. Once outside of a meeting, I overheard a conversation between another sober student and a woman who lived in the town where I went to school. She was explaining why so many local residents disliked the students. She described the common perception of the students as arrogant and self-centered, and went on to tell the following student story. I am a nurse, and I work in the emergency room. 2 years ago, a student was brought in by ambulance in the middle of the night. He had gotten drunk and walked through a second-story window and fallen 20 feet head first into a concrete window well. He was brought in covered in blood. His head had swollen to the size of a watermelon. He kept swearing at all the nurses and doctors, telling them to keep their hands off of him and threatening to sue. He was, without a doubt, the single most obnoxious person I had ever met. At that point, I interrupted her. That was me, I said. That was my last drunk. I had walked through that window when I was 19 years old. How had I gotten there? I had always been a good kid growing up, the kind of son that other mothers loved. I was at the top of my classes academically and had been in almost no trouble for the first 17 years of my life. I would like to say that was because of my well-developed moral fiber. In fact, much of it was a result of fear. My earliest memories included threats by my parents to throw me out into the street for the slightest act of disobedience. The thought of being forced to live on the street is pretty terrifying for a 6-year-old. Those threats, coupled with a fair amount of physical punishment, kept me frightened and obedient. As I grew older, however, I made a plan. I would be dutiful until I graduated from high school. Then I would escape to college, secure my economic future, and never go home again. Just after my 18th birthday, I left for college. I was, I thought, finally free. I was in for a rude awakening. Like many alcoholics, I had spent much of my life feeling different, as though I just didn't quite fit in. I covered those feelings and my low self-esteem by being one of the smartest people in the group, if not the smartest. Additionally, I became a performer in the crowds, always ready with a quick joke to point out the humor in any situation. I managed to bring a great deal of laughter into my life. I went to a college filled with people who had also spent their entire lives at or near the top of their academic classes. Suddenly, I was no longer special. To make matters worse, many of them had what I only dreamed of: money. My family was strictly working class, struggling to get by on what father earned. Money had always been a big issue, and I equated it with security, prestige, and worth. My father was fond of saying that the sole purpose of life is to make money. I had classmates whose names were household words that connotated wealth. I was ashamed of my family and ashamed of myself. My shaky confidence crumbled. I was terrified of being found out. I knew that if others discovered who I really was, they wouldn't like me, and I would be left alone, worthless and alone. Then I discovered alcohol. I had tried it a few times in high school, but never got enough to get drunk. I knew that getting drunk meant being out of control. My escape plan required that I always keep my wits about me. I was too afraid to be out of control. When I got to college, however, that fear left me. In order to fit in, I pretended at first that I had as extensive a drinking history as any of the classmates. It wasn't long before my history surpassed everyone's. My drinking career was short and destructive, and my alcoholic progression was very fast. I get drunk for the first time in October. By November, people were willing to wager money that I could not go 1 week without a drink. I won, and in celebration, drank myself sick. By January 1st, I was a daily drunk, and by April, a daily drug user as well. I didn't last long. As I look back on that period, I realize how true it is that one of the primary differences between alcoholics and non alcoholics is that non alcoholics change their behavior to meet their goals, and alcoholics change their goals to meet their behaviors. Everything that had been important to me, all of my dreams, goals, and aspirations, were swept away in a wave of booze. I quickly realized that I could not drink and function at any level. That didn't matter. I was willing to give up anything so that I could keep drinking. I went from being a solid A student to nearly flunking out of school, being anointed as a class leader to being shunned as a pariah. I almost never went to class and did little of the required reading. I never attended many of the cultural events that's sponsored by the college. I forsook everything that makes college worthwhile in favor of drinking. Occasionally, some sliver of pride would work its way through the chaos, resentment, and fear, and cause me to look at my life. But the shame was too great, and I would drive it back down with bottles of vodka and cases of beer. Because my college was fairly small, it did not take long for me to come to the attention of the college deans. It was under their watchful eyes that I first agreed to enter counseling. Well, the administration saw this as an opportunity to help a troubled student. I saw it as a bargain. I would go to counseling to make sure they were happy, and they would owe me none. Not surprisingly, the counseling had no effect. My daily drinking continued unabated. About a year later, I realized that I was in trouble. I'd failed a class during the winter term. I'd rarely attended and had not turned in the term paper on which 50% of the grade was based. The spring term was looking bleak. I was enrolled in a class that I had attended only once. I had not written any of the required papers or even bothered to show up for the midterm exam. I was bound for failure and expulsion. My life had become unmanageable, and I knew it. I went back to the dean, who guided me into counseling. For the first time, I admitted to myself and to someone else that I had a problem with alcohol. I didn't think I was an alcoholic. I wasn't even sure what it was, but I knew my life was out of control. The dean allowed me to withdraw from that class the day before the final exam on one condition. I had to enter a treatment center. I agreed. A few days went by. With the pressure lifted, my life did not look so unmanageable. In fact, it looked as if I was back in the saddle. So, I thanked the dean for his help, but told him that I would be okay on my own. I did not go to rehab. 2 weeks later, I walked through a second-story window. After insulting the emergency room personnel, I slipped into unconsciousness, where I remained for 5 days. I awoke in a neck brace, with complete double vision. My parents were furious. I was flown home, and the future looked bleak. God's timing, however, is impeccable. My college had a long history of drinkers, including Dr. Bob. At the time of my incident, the deans were assessing how to respond to student alcohol abuse and were waiting to try out their latest idea, Alcoholics Anonymous. I was the test case. They told me in no uncertain terms that I would never get back into college unless I went to AA. Under that pressure, I went to my first meeting. Looking back, that might have been the first healthy decision I ever made with respect to alcohol. One definition of a bottom is the point when the last thing you lost, or the next thing you are about to lose, is more important to you than booze. That point is different for everyone, and some of us die before we get there. For me, though, it was clear. I was willing to do anything to get back into school. I went to my first AA meeting with absolutely no idea what AA was about. I am from a large Irish Catholic family, and I have had several relatives in and out of the program. AA, like prison, was shameful, however, and never discussed. I also had no idea what alcoholism was. I remember a girlfriend once told me that her mother had a drinking problem, but she wasn't an alcoholic. Curious, I asked what the difference was. An alcoholic, she told me, is someone who needs to drink alcohol every day, even if it is only one drink. A person with a drinking problem does not have to drink every day, but once she starts, she cannot stop. By that definition, I was an alcoholic with a drinking problem. I was surprised by my first meeting. It was in a church, and whatever I had expected, it was not this. The room was filled with well-dressed, smiling, happy people. No rancid coats or 3-day beards. No bloodshot eyes, wheezing coughs, or shaky hands. But laughter. Someone was talking about God, and I was sure I was in the wrong place. Then a woman introduced herself and said that she was an alcoholic. I knew then I was in AA. She spoke about her feelings of insecurity replaced by confidence, fear replaced by faith, and resentment replaced by love, despair replaced by joy. I knew those feelings. I had insecurity, fear, resentment, and despair. I could not believe it. Here was a person who was happy. It seemed like a long time since I'd seen one of those. After the meeting, people welcomed me with open arms and gave me their telephone numbers. The discussion meeting was followed by a speaker meeting where I had my first awakening in AA. The speaker said, "If you're an apple, you'd better be the best apple you can be, but you can never be an orange." I was an apple, all right, but for the first time I understood that I'd spent my life trying to be an orange. I had looked around at a room filled with apples, and, if I was understanding the speaker, most of them were no longer trying to be oranges. My progress in AA, however, was slow. I refused to go to meetings outside my neighborhood, which meant that I went only Tuesday and Thursday nights. I always felt better after a meeting. I remember times when something upsetting would happen on a Friday, and I would tell myself, I wish it were Tuesday so I could go to the meeting. No matter how many suggestions I heard and how many rides were offered. However, I simply would not go to meetings on other nights. People gave me many other good suggestions as well. They suggested that I stay out of relationships. I was young and single, and I rejected this idea out of hand. For the first year, I bounced from one sick relationship to another. They suggested that I get a sponsor. I had no idea what a sponsor was and was too proud to ask, but I was sure I didn't need one. After all, I was smarter than the rest of these people. They might need someone to tell them how to run their lives, but double vision, neck brace, and all, I'm doing just fine on my own. People suggested that I find a higher power. I was not fooled. I knew when they said higher power, they meant God, and I knew that God waited for me to step out of line just once so that he could take his revenge. I wanted no part of God. With this resistance, I plodded along for a few months. Whenever people asked me how I was doing, I would say, fine, just fine, no matter how hard I was crying inside. Then I reached the crossroads. I was sober about 6 months, and I was not getting any better. I contemplated suicide almost every day. My emotions swung between paralyzing despair and murderous rage, often in the space of a single moment. I was not happy, joyous, or free. I was miserable, and I was sick of it. I decided I had had enough. I went to my Tuesday night meeting, finally intent on sharing honestly. I arrived at the meeting, and no one else was there. This meeting, which routinely numbered 20 people, was empty. I waited for a few minutes and was preparing to leave when a man who I barely knew walked through the door. He suggested, and I have a meeting. I'm sure it was a bad idea. He asked me how I was doing. That was all I needed. The pain, fear, misery, anger, loss, resentment, and despair came pouring out. For the next 45 minutes, I talked to this man, who continued to nod his head, smile, and say, "Yeah, I remember feeling that way." For the first time, I made completely honest contact with another human being. I showed someone who I really was without fear of rejection. I took an action that was designed to make me feel rather than just look better. I was met with acceptance and love. When I had finished talking, he told me something simple. You don't have to drink over it. What an idea. I had thought situations had made me drink. If I was angry, I drank. If I was happy, I drank. Bored, excited, elated, or depressed, I drank. Here was a man telling me, independent of my life situation, I did not have to drink. If I stuck with AA, I could stay sober under any and all conditions. He gave me hope, and in many ways, he symbolized the door through which I finally walked to Alcoholics Anonymous. I began to change. I began to pray. I became actively involved in working the steps. I had previously dismissed them as the tools of mental inferiors. Now, I embrace them as the rungs on the ladder to salvation. I began working with a sponsor and became active in my home group. I did not understand how making coffee or cleaning up after meetings could have anything to do with staying sober, but older members told me that service would keep me sober, so I tried it. It worked. My life began to change. Just before my first anniversary, I was readmitted to college. I arrived back on campus terrified. All I had known there was drinking. How was I ever going to stay sober under these conditions? The answer was simple. I threw myself into AA. Some very loving people took me under their wings. I had the opportunity to perform a fair amount of 12-step work with other students, and by the time I graduated, there was a thriving AA community at the school. After graduation, I attended law school. I arrived to find an AA that was very different from that to which I had grown accustomed. I was sure I would get drunk because those people weren't doing it right. My sponsor back in college, aware of my propensity for finding fault, assured me that if my new friends were not doing it right, that it was my obligation to show them how. So I did. Driven by fear and conceit, I set out to remake AA in my image. I am certain that if membership had depended on being liked, I would have been expelled. After some time, I called my sponsor to report my progress. He stopped me short with a simple question. These people who aren't doing it right, are they staying sober? I admitted that despite their failings, they were staying sober. Good, he said. You have told them what AA is. Now it's time for you to listen, to figure out how they're staying sober. I followed that suggestion and began to listen. Slowly but surely, some wisdom and humility began to creep in. I became more teachable. I found God working all around me, where previously I was sure I'd been alone. When I opened my eyes enough to see the miracle, I found it was right in front of my face. I was growing in God's love. I was fortunate to have an opportunity to spend time abroad during the law school. That was something I had dreamed of doing while drinking, but when push came to shove, I drank. Now sober, I have been in meetings probably a dozen countries, and have always been amazed at the message that transcends all linguistic and cultural differences. There is a solution. Together we can live soberly, joyously, and freely. My life has been one of great joy. I am now 33 years old, and God willing, in 1 month, I will celebrate my 14th sober AA anniversary. I am surrounded by loving friends on whom I depend and who depend on me. I have reconciled with my parents from whom I have been estranged. My life is filled with laughter again, something that alcohol had taken away. I was married shortly after my 9th anniversary to a loving woman. 1 week before my 12th anniversary, our son was born. Through him, I learned more about unconditional love, the value of wonder, and the sheer joy of being alive. I have a wonderful job that most days I appreciate. I am active in AA service work and have both a sponsor and several sponsees with whom it is a privilege to work. All of those are gifts from God. I express my gratitude by enjoying them. I once knew a woman who was crying before a meeting. She was approached by a 5-year-old girl who told her, "You don't have to cry here. This is a good place. They took my daddy and they made him better." That is exactly what AA did for me. It took me and it made me better. For that, I am eternally grateful. They nearly lost it all. The 15 stories in this group tell of alcoholism at its miserable worst. Many tried everything: hospitals, special treatments, sanitariums, asylums, and jails. Nothing worked. Loneliness, great physical and mental agony, these were the common lot. Most had taken shattering losses on nearly every front of life. Some went on trying to live with alcohol. Others wanted to die. Alcoholism had respected nobody, whether rich nor poor, learned nor unlettered. All found themselves headed for the same destruction, and it seemed they could do nothing whatsoever to stop it. Now sober for years, they tell us how they got well. They prove to almost anyone's satisfaction that it's never too late to try Alcoholics Anonymous. Chapter 1: My Bottle, My Resentments, and Me. From childhood trauma to Skid Row drunk, this hobo finally found a higher power, bringing sobriety in a long-lost family. When I rode into a small mountain town in an empty freight car, my matted beard and filthy hair would have reached nearly to my belt, if I'd even had a belt. I wore a lice-infested, grimy Mexican poncho over a reeking pajama top, and a ragged pair of jeans stuffed into cowboy boots with no heels. I carried a knife in one boot and a .38 revolver in the other. For 6 years I'd been fighting for survival on skid rows and riding across the country in freights. I hadn't eaten in a long time, so was half starved, down to 130 pounds. I was mean, and I was a drunk. But I'm ahead of myself. I believe my alcoholism really began when I was 11 years old and my mother was brutally murdered. Until then, my life had been much the same as of any other boys who lived in a small town during that period. One night, my mother failed to return home from her job at a car manufacturing plant. The next morning, there was still no sign of her, or any clue to why she had disappeared. With great apprehension, the police were called. Since I was a mama's boy, this was especially traumatic for me. And to make matters unbelievably worse, a few days later, the police came home and arrested my father. They had found my mom's mutilated body in a field outside of town and wanted to question him. In that instant, the family life I knew was destroyed. My father was soon returned because the police had found a pair of glasses that did not belong to him at the murder scene. This clue led to the man who had so brutally killed my mother. At school, the gossip was vicious. At home, there was chaos, and no one would tell me what was really happening. So I withdrew and began to block out the reality around me. If I could pretend it didn't exist, it might go away. I became extremely lonely and defiant. The confusion, pain, and grief had begun to subside when an article appeared in a murder mystery magazine about my family's misfortune. The children at school started the gossip and scrutiny all over again, and I retreated further and became angrier and more withdrawn. It was easier that way, because people would leave me alone if I acted disturbed even before they tried to inquire. Because my father was unable to care for all 9 of us, the family had to be split up. About a year later, he remarried, and my oldest brother offered to take me in. He and his new wife tried to help me, but I was just so defensive, there was little they or anyone else could do. Finally, I took a job sorting soda bottles in a grocery store where I found I could forget it if I worked hard enough. In addition, it was a good place to steal beer and be a big guy with the other kids in school. That's the way my drinking began, as a way to make the pain go away. After several years of semi delinquent adolescence, I was old enough to join the Marines. Leaving behind the origin of my bitterness, I thought my life would be better and the drinking not so bad. However, during boot camp, I recognized that this was not the answer. The discipline, the authority, the tight schedule went against my very nature. But it was a 2 year stint, so there had to be a way to function in spite of the anger and now hatred that seethed through me. Every night found me at a bar drinking until they threw me out. That got me through the week. On weekends, we went to a club nearby. This place was managed by people who drank as much or more than I did. I became a constant customer. Arguments and fights were a regular occurrence. I managed to complete the 2 years and was given an honorable discharge. I was sent on my way, leaving the Marine base behind and feeling homesick for my old environs. I hitchhiked back to my old hometown and returned to my brother's home. I soon found work as a painter for a construction company in town. By now, drinking had become a constant part of my life. Through some friends, I met a woman I really cared for, and soon we were married. A year later, our daughter was born, and eventually 2 boys. Oh, how I loved my brood. This nice little family should have settled me down, but instead, my drinking progressed. It finally reached the point where I was intolerable to live with, and my wife filed for divorce. I just went berserk, and the sheriff ordered me to leave the town. I knew if I stayed, my anger at my wife for taking those children away from me would get me into more trouble than I could ever handle. So once again, I set off. I left with my hatred and my resentment and the clothes on my back. This time was for good. In the largest city close by, I could be found, dead broke, drinking myself into oblivion on Skid Row. At first, a day labor job provided for rent and food, but before long, all the money went to booze. I found a mission where someone in need could sleep and eat free, but the bugs were so bad and the food so terrible, and people were such thieves. I decided that it was easier to sleep outside and that I really didn't need to eat so often. I found that hobo jungles, parked cars, and abandoned houses made nice places for my bottle, my resentments, and me. No one dared to bother me. I was utterly bewildered at where life had taken me. Other hobos I met taught me the safest way to hop on a moving freight train and how to protect myself. They told me who were the easiest people to get a handout from and how to scam them. My biggest problem at that time was to find a way to get enough to drink to keep the reality of my life at bay. I was consumed by hate. For the last 6 years, I went from Skid Row to Skid Row. One boxcar headed in any direction was as good as another. I had no place to go. One thing about it, I never got lost, 'cause I never cared where I was. I crossed the United States 3 times with no plan, no reason, not eating half the time. I hung out with other misfits like myself. Someone would say they were hiring in Florida or New York, maybe even Wyoming. And then off we'd go. By the time we would finally get there, they would say they were not hiring anymore. That's all right, 'cause we didn't want to work anyway. One scorching day when I was in a desert town drinking, something unusual happened. I felt as though I had reached the point where I couldn't go on. To get away from everyone, I managed to find some booze and started walking out into the desert thinking, I'll just go until I die. Soon, so drunk, I couldn't walk another step. I fell onto the ground and moaned, Oh God, please help me. I must have passed out, because hours later I came to and found my way back to town. At the time, I had no idea what made me change my mind about death. Today I know it was that my higher power took over my life. By this time, I was so wild-eyed and filthy, people would shy away from me. I hated the look of fear on their faces when they saw me. They looked at me as if I were not human, and maybe I wasn't. In a large city, I took to sleeping on the grates with a piece of plastic over me so I wouldn't freeze. One night, I found a clothing drop box I could get into. It made a nice warm place to sleep, and I could get new clothes in the morning. In the middle of the night, someone threw in more clothes. I opened the top, looked out, and shouted thanks. That woman threw up her hands and ran away screaming, Lordy, Lordy! She jumped into her car and screeched off. I was just about as sad a figure of a man as is possible when I jumped off that freight. I found an empty refrigerator car sitting on a siding and took up residence in it. Here you could get on welfare very easily, so I went off to apply. Now I could eat. It was my 3rd time in this town, so I headed straight for my favorite bar. Here I met a barmaid who drank like a fish and was as mean a woman as I'd ever seen. But she had a place to live, so I moved in, and thus began the romance of a lifetime. I finally had a roof over my head, sheets and food. All we did was drink and fight. But she worked at the bar, so it kept us going. With just enough cash for booze, we drank continuously for several months. Then on my way to find a drink, I ran into one of my old hobo buddies, an older man. I remembered him as an excessive drinker, an alcoholic. And here he was walking towards me down the street in a white shirt, a tie, and a suit. He was looking marvelous with a big smile on his face. He told me he'd quit drinking and how he managed to do it and how much better he felt. My first thought was, if he can do that, I can do that. And much better because I'm only 33. He took me down to this club where there were some other recovered alcoholics. I drank coffee. Well, they all told me how they had changed. It looked like they might have something here. If they could do this, maybe, just maybe, I could too. Their enthusiasm was catching, but I began to feel excitement inside, but I had no idea was why. I was rushed off to tell my new girlfriend about what had happened and how great it would be if we'd just quit drinking. "You're nuts!" she yelled at me. "You can just drag your rear back to your refrigerator car. I've got parties to go to." Although I seemed unable to transmit my excitement, I told her more. The next day we both quit drinking. There are no words to explain why it happened or how it happened. It just did. It was a miracle. Every day we're able to stay sober was another gift from the higher power I'd given up on many years long before. The next year we took a job managing a camp outside of town where drunks were sent to get dried out, sobered up. It was our responsibility to see that they had food and stayed out of trouble. Both tasks were almost impossible at times, but we kept trying. With some support from old timers in AA, we lasted a year. This was a volunteer job, and we had little money for ourselves. When the year was up, I went over to the list of drunks who had been through the place. 178 in all. I exclaimed to my partner, "Not a single one of them is sober today." "Yeah," she replied, "but you and I are." So that happy note, we were then married. My sponsor told me if I wanted to form a relationship with my higher power, it would be necessary for me to change. At a meeting one night, a member said, "It's not about how much you drink, it's what drinking does to you." That statement changed my whole attitude. Of course, I had to surrender and accept I was an alcoholic. I had a hard time giving up the anger at my ex-wife for taking my kids, the man who murdered my mother, and at my father for what I felt was deserting me. But these resentments eased with time as I began to comprehend my own defects of character. I became acquainted with some monks in a nearby monastery who listened to my story with some amazement and were able to help me understand myself. At the same time, my sponsor and the other old timers who had taken us under their wings loved us back to rejoin society. Gradually, the ice that was my heart melted, and I changed as my relationship with a higher power grew. Life began to take on a whole new meaning. I made what amends were possible, but I knew I would have to return to my childhood home to clear up that part of the past. But we were busy with our own paint contracting company now, and as the years passed by, the opportunity to go back home just did not come. The months following the day we quit drinking have turned into years. I have become increasingly more devoted to this program that saved not only my life, but my wife's also. Eventually, I became involved in AA service and helped get a central office started for our groups. We both became active in general service and began traveling all over the state going to meetings. To my surprise, both of us were given the opportunity to serve as delegates to the General Service Conference. What joy we found in this! One of my most memorable moments was when the opening of the conference, the chairman of AA's General Service Board said, "We are all gathered here tonight, not as individuals, but for the betterment of Alcoholics Anonymous all over the world." The years flashed back to when I was on the grates outside that very hotel, frantically trying to keep from freezing. I was overwhelmed by God's grace just to be there. One day, a friend of mine who writes for a living asked if he could write the story of my life for a magazine. He assured there would be no anonymity problem, so I agreed. I had been sober for almost 25 years at this time and had no idea what God, as I understood him, had to do or was about to do for me. My oldest brother, the one who had just taken me in, happened to subscribe to this magazine and just happened to read the article. This began an amazing chain of events that had altered not only our lives, but the lives of my family and many others. It is nothing short of a modern day miracle. God has done for me what I could not do for myself. The article gave the name of the town I live in, so after my brother and sister-in-law finished reading the story, they called directory assistance and found me. The first time we had spoken, more than 30 years, I burst into tears, and so did they. They told me after my disappearance following the divorce, my family had tried to locate me. They were concerned because someone had told them that I was either dead or had left the country. I felt bad that I had worried them like that, but in my self-centeredness, it had never occurred to me that they cared that much. One by one, I talked to my brothers and sisters in the next 24 hours. My brother gave me the phone number of my own daughter, whom I hadn't seen for 27 years, and I called her. Next, I talked to both of my sons. Oh God, what an experience. I was so overwhelmed by the memories and the lost years that it was difficult for me to even speak. I spent several weeks crying as the old hurts rose to the surface and were healed. Later, we had a big family reunion back in my hometown. It was a happy day for all of us to be together for the first time since we were split up. My father had passed away, but all his children were there with their families, a large and joyous crowd. Finally, all those years of wondering about my family, my higher power had acted through my friend to undo the tangled circumstances and allow me to make amends to the people who had been hurt by my bitterness. I believe that I am the living proof of AA saying don't give up until the miracle happens. In early sobriety, I had to live in a flop house filled with active drunks. Not drinking, I became acutely aware of my surroundings, the foul smells, the noise, the hostility, the physical danger. My resentments mounted at the realization that I had flushed a career down the drain, disgraced and alienated my family, and had been relegated to the meanest of the institutions and Skid Row shelters. But I was also able to realize that this bonfire of resentment and rage was beckoning me to pick up a drink and plunge me into my death. Then I realized that I had to separate my sobriety from everything else that was going on in my life. No matter what happened or didn't happen, I couldn't drink. In fact, none of these things that I was going through had anything to do with sobriety. The tides of life flow endlessly, for better or for worse, both the good and the bad, and I cannot allow my sobriety to become dependent on these ups and downs of living. Sobriety must live a life of its own. More important, I came to believe that I cannot do this alone. From childhood, despite the love I experienced, I never let people, even those closest to me inside my life. All my life I had lived the deepest of lies, not sharing with anyone my true thoughts and feelings. Though I had a direct line to God, and I built a wall of distrust around myself. In AA, I faced the pervasive we of the 12 steps and gradually realized that I could separate and protect my sobriety from outside hazards only in as much as I rely on the sober experience of other AA members and share their journey through the steps of recovery. The rewards of sobriety are bountiful and as progressive as the disease they counteract. Certainly among these rewards for me are release from the prison of uniqueness and the realization that participation in the AA way of life is a blessing and a privilege beyond estimate. A blessing to live a life free from the pain and degradation of drinking, filled with the joy of useful, sober living, and a privilege to grow in sobriety, one day at a time, and bring the message of hope as it was brought to me. He lived only to drink. I had been preached to, analyzed, cursed, and counseled, but no one had ever said, I identify with what's going on with you. It happened to me, and this is what I did about it. On looking back at my life, I can't see anything that would have warned me or my family of the devastation that alcoholism had in store for us. To our collective memory, there was no drinking on either side of the family. We were from a long Southern ministry Baptist tradition. My father was a minister. I attended his church every Sunday with the rest of the family, and like them, was very active in religious work. My parents were also educators. My father was the principal of the school I attended, and my mother was taught there. They were both champions of community outreach and well respected. There was caring and togetherness among us. My maternal grandmother, herself a deeply religious woman who lived with us, helped raise me and was a living example of unconditional love. Early on, the values of morality and learning were impressed upon me. I was taught that if you were well educated and morally upstanding, there was nothing that could stand in the way of your success. In this life or hereafter, as a child and young man, I was evangelical, literally drunken with moral zeal and intellectual ambition. I excelled in school and dreamed of a career in teaching and helping others. It was not until I was an adult, away from the family and doing graduate work at a prestigious East Coast university, that I had my first real drink of alcohol. I had tasted beer and a little wine before that, and had long since decided that fruit juice tasted better. I had never been inside a bar until one evening some fellow students persuaded me to go with them to the local cocktail lounge. I was fascinated. I still remember the hazy, smoky atmosphere, the hushed voices, the tinkle of ice in the glasses. It was pure sophistication. But most of all, I remember that first sensation of the warm whiskey radiating through my body. I drank so much that night, no one believed I hadn't been drinking all the time. And I didn't get drunk, although there were parts of the evening that I didn't remember the next day. But more important than anything else that night, I belonged. I was at home in the universe. I was comfortable with people. Despite my active church and school life as a child, I had never felt really comfortable. I was actually very nervous and insecure around people, and most of the time forced myself to be outgoing like my parents because I thought it was my duty. But this night in the bar was like no other in time. Not only was I completely at ease, but I actually loved all the strangers around me, and they loved me in return, I thought. All because of this magic potion called alcohol. What a revelation. The following year, I began my career as a teacher. My first job was at a college 50 miles from my hometown. Before the school year ended, I had been asked to resign because of my drinking. Within that short space of time, drinking had become an accepted way of life, and I loved booze. I loved people who drank in the places where they drank. At that time in my life, although I had lost my first job and embarrassed my family, it never occurred to me that alcohol could be a problem. From that first night at the bar a year earlier, I had made a profound decision that was to direct my life for many years to come. Alcohol was my friend, and I would follow it to the end of the earth. After that first job, there were many more that I lost, all because of my drinking. I was taught in many schools and in different states. I was no longer the moral young man who had seen his destiny in helping people live better. I was loud and arrogant, angry, abusive, always blaming and confronting others. I was getting arrested, beaten up. I had developed a foul mouth and frequently drunk in class, even in public places. Finally, my teaching career ended in total dishonor. My family could not understand what had happened to me, nor could I. In moments of clarity, I was full of shame, guilt, and remorse. I had become an embarrassment to all who had faith in me, and all to others I'd become a joke. I wanted to die. Now, alcohol has become the only friend I have. I wound up in the insane asylum, which probably saved my life. I don't remember how I got there, but I do know that I had become suicidal. I became comfortable there, and months later, I cried when I was dismissed. I knew by that time that I could not make it in the world. I was safe behind the barred hospital windows and wanted to stay there for the rest of my life. I couldn't drink beer there, but tranquilizers and other drugs abounded, and I helped myself to it. The word alcoholic was never mentioned. I do not believe the doctors knew much more about alcoholism than I did. When I was released from the asylum, my life had become a series of new beginnings. In time, I picked up the drink and got good jobs. I lost them, just as I had in the past. All the fear, remorse, terrible depression returned tenfold. It still did not register that the drinking might be the cause of all this misery. I sold my blood. I prostituted myself. I even drank more. I became homeless, slept in the bus, the train terminals. I scrounged cigarette butts off the sidewalk and drank from a common wine bottle with other drunks. I made my way to the men's municipal shelter and made it my home. I panhandled. By this time, I lived only to drink. I did not bathe or change clothes. I stank. I became thin and ill. I had begun to hear voices and accepted them as death omens. I was frightened, arrogant, enraged, and resentful of man, God, and the universe. There was nothing left to live for. I was too frightened to die. It was at this point that a woman who was a social worker on Skid Row and a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous sat me down in her office and told me her story, how she drank, what happened, and how she got sober. No one had ever done this before. I had been preached to, analyzed, cursed, and counseled, but no one had ever said, I identify with what's going on with you. It's happened to me. And this is what I did about it. She got me to my first AA meeting that same evening. The people at the meetings gathered around me in kindness in those early days, and I did not drink. But the spiritual demons of withdrawal descended on me. I was black, and these people were white. What did they know about suffering? What could they tell me? I was black and bright, and the world had consistently rejected me for it. I hated this world, its people, and its punishing God. Yet I believed in AA were sincere, and whatever they believed in was working for them. I just did not believe that AA would work for me as a black drunk. I genuinely believed that I was different until much later, when I had what I know now to be my first spiritual awakening. I was an alcoholic and I didn't have to drink. I also learned that alcoholism is an equal opportunity illness. It does not discriminate. It is not restricted to race, creed, or geography. At last, I was released from the bondage of my uniqueness. In early sobriety, I had to continue to live in a flop house filled with active drunks. Not drinking, I became acutely aware of my surroundings. The foul smells, the noise, the hostility, and physical danger. My resentments mounted at the realization that I had flushed a career down the drain, disgraced and alienated my family, and had been relegated to the meanest of institutions, Skid Row shelter. But I was able to realize that this bonfire of resentment and rage was beckoning me to pick up a drink and plunge into my death. I then realized I had to separate my sobriety from everything else that was going on in life. No matter what happened or didn't happen, I didn't have to drink. In fact, none of these things that I was going through had anything to do with sobriety. The tides of life flow endlessly, for better or for worse, both good and bad, and I cannot allow my sobriety to become dependent on these ups and downs of living. Sobriety must have a life of its own. More important, I came to believe that I cannot do this alone. From childhood, despite the love I experienced, I never let people down, even those closest to me or inside my life. All my life, I had lived the deepest of lies, not sharing with anyone my true thoughts and feelings. I thought I had a direct line to God. I built a wall of distrust around myself. In AA, I faced the pervasive we of the 12 steps and gradually realized that I can separate my and protect my body from surrounding outside hazards as much as I rely on the sober experience of other AA members and share their journey through the steps to recovery. The rewards of sobriety are bountiful and progressive as the disease they counteract. Certainly among these rewards for me are release from the prison of uniqueness and the realization that participation in the AA way of life is a blessing and a privilege beyond estimate. A blessing to live. And a free life, free from pain and degradation of drinking, and filled with the joy of useful, sober living. And a privilege to grow in sobriety, one day at a time, and bring the message of hope that was brought to me. Chapter 3, Safe Haven. This AA found that the process of discovering who he really was began with knowing who he didn't want to be. Prison. What a wonderful life it is. Here I am, sitting in a cell, waiting for my hot pot to heat up so I can have a cup of instant coffee and reminisce. As I ponder my current circumstance, I reflect on the undeniable fact that I am well into my 4th year of incarceration. I still wake up some mornings wishing it were all a bad dream. I didn't grow up in a home that used alcohol, But when I took my first drink at age 13, I knew I would drink again. Being raised in a home founded on high moral standards didn't seem to instill any fear of consequences once I took a drink of booze. Sometimes I rode my bicycle around the neighborhood. I would spy a grown-up in his yard drinking a beer. Returning later, when I knew he was not at home, I would break into his house to steal the golden beverage from the refrigerator. I recall too well the morning when another guy and I stole my dad's credit cards and pickup truck so we could run off to California to become movie stars. We had a pistol so we could rob stores when the time came to stock up on beer, cash, and cigarettes. Before the first day of travel was over, however, I told my friend I couldn't go on any longer and needed to return home. I knew my mom and dad were climbing the walls with worry right now. My friend refused to turn back, so I let him out of the truck. I never saw him again. My parents may have recognized my behavior as some serious adolescent rebellion, but they had no idea it was fueled by the disease of alcoholism. At age 16, I got a part-time job as a disc jockey for a local radio station. Those in a position to know observed that I had a knack for this kind of work, so I dropped out of high school and started spinning records full time. Drinking and partying began a pattern that lasted for many years. When the alcoholism became obvious to my employers and began to affect my job performance, I simply resigned and sought employment with another broadcasting company. I recall one day I was doing a midday show. I realized I simply could not go on another minute without a drink. So I put on an album and quietly walked out of the radio station unnoticed. I drove to the liquor store and got a bottle of whiskey. I got back in my car, turned on the radio, and started drinking. As I sat there listening to song after song, the album eventually came to an end, and all you could hear was the needle scratching against the turntable. Someone at the station finally realized I was no longer in the control room, and they put on another record. During my years into the broadcast industry, I worked from time to time as a radio storm chaser. It was my job to use radar information to follow the storm and spot tornadoes, hail, flooding, and storm-related hazards or damage. I would then use a cellular phone in my vehicle to give live reports over the radio while chasing the storm. One night, the storm was extremely turbulent. Our listening audience was larger than ever as I gave my report, sounding as if I were on the front lines of a war zone. The following day, a newspaper honored our station with a nice article about the professional job we did on weather coverage. But what no one knew was that all of those professional storm reports were called in from the safety of my back patio as I ad-libbed a line just a bit better with each fresh glass of bourbon and cola. Periodically, I worked as a broadcast journalist and reported many news stories on location. I regularly drank on the job and was frequently loaded when calls came in about automobile accidents that were alcohol related. There I was, with a mic in one hand and a flask in the other, as I jumped into the news van and rushed to the scene of the accident, just as drunk, or more so, as the one who caused it. It was inevitable that I would one day become the news rather than just report it, by causing a serious accident as a result of my drinking. I had experienced run-ins with the law several times for not paying fines, public intoxication, fighting, and driving while intoxicated. But nothing could compare with the time the police come to me downtown for questioning concerning a murder. I had been drinking the night before and hadn't gotten involved in a dangerous accident. I knew I hadn't committed a murder, but here I was being considered a prime suspect. An hour or two into questioning, it was determined that I had not committed the crime, and I was released. This was quite enough to get my full attention, though. I went home and called a friend I had seen at a local mall a week earlier. I hadn't talked to her for a couple of years, but I had noticed how different she looked and behaved. As we spoke, she said she hadn't had a drink for over a year. She told me about a group of friends who were helping her stay sober. I lied to her and claimed I hadn't had a drink myself for quite some time. I don't think she believed me, but she gave me her phone number and encouraged me to call if I would like to meet her friends. Later, when I worked up the nerve to call her, I admitted I had a drinking problem and wanted to stop. She picked me up and took me to my first AA meeting. In Alcoholics Anonymous, I knew I had found a protective haven. But during the ensuing 4.5 years, I fell into the category known in AA's parlance as a chronic slipper. I may get a good 6 months of sobriety under my belt, but then I would get a bottle to celebrate. I did all the things that were suggested for me not to do. Within my first year around AA, I made some major decisions, like getting married, renting the most expensive apartment I could find, not using my sponsor, avoiding the steps, hanging around the old haunts with my drinking pals, and talking more than listening during meetings. In short, I was not responding to the miracle of AA. My disease progressed and I became a regular patient in detox hospitals, intensive care units, and treatment centers. Permanent insanity was drawing near, and the gates of death were in view. There is a saying that alcoholics either get sobered up, locked up, or covered up. Since I was not genuinely willing to do what it took to get sobered up, I had the other two options to face. I just never dreamed it would happen so quickly. It was a beautiful September weekend, just before Labor Day. I made the decision to buy a case of beer and a bottle of wine. Later in the evening, I drank whiskey on top of the beer and wine, blacked out, committed a drunken crime, was arrested, and within 10 days was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. I guess an alcoholic death can come in much the same way. I drink, I black out, I die. At least with prison, I would have another chance at life somewhere down the line. I can't start to describe the forced humility that is placed upon an alcoholic who comes to prison. Although I deserved to be in prison, the trauma was horrible. The only encouragement and hope I was able to find was from reading the personal stories in the back of a tattered big book that I found in my cell. Then one day I heard something that was music to my ears. A correctional officer announced that an AA meeting was to be held in the chapel. When I walked into the meeting, I took a seat in the circle of chairs, where I once again found a protective haven. As I pen this story, 3.5 years have passed since that meeting in the chapel. I've moved to a larger prison unit and have remained very active in the awesome program of Alcoholics Anonymous. AA has accomplished so many things in my life today. It has given me sanity and an all-around sense of balance. Now willing to listen and take suggestions, I have found that the process of discovering who I really am begins with knowing who I really don't want to be. And although the disease of alcohol inside of me is like gravity, just waiting to pull me down, AA and the 12 steps are like the power that causes an airplane to become airborne. It only works when the pilot is doing the right things to make it work. So, as I have worked the program, I have grown emotionally and intellectually. I not only have peace with God, I have the peace of God through an active God consciousness. I have not only recovered from alcoholism, I have become whole in person, body, spirit, and soul. I have had one God thing after another happen to me after submitting myself to the principles of AA. The trial officials who convicted me and the victims of my crime have all decided to support me and my early release from prison. Coincidence? I think not. I've received letters from former employers who have heard of my sobriety and have offered me employment again in the radio industry. These are just examples of God doing for me what I couldn't do for myself. One of the things I have committed to do in return for God's grace is to immediately become active in a correctional committee upon my release. Bringing the AA message back into jails and prisons is extremely important to me and for my own sobriety today. From experience, I've realized that I cannot go back and make a brand new start. But through AA, I can start from now and make a brand new end. Chapter 4. Listening to the Wind. It took an angel to introduce this Native American woman to AA and recovery. I started drinking when I was around 11 years old. I stayed with my brother and his wife just outside of Gallup, New Mexico. We were poor. The smell of beans and fresh tortillas symbolized home to me. I slept in a bed with 3 other children, where we huddled close to keep warm in the freezing winter. The snow was deep around us. I had a hard time reading and understanding schoolwork, so I skipped school every chance I got. My dad and grandma had told me the old stories about the Longhouse and the travels of our people across the deserts and the mountains of this country. I met a boy and together we ditched school, stole a truck. We drank tequila and explored the red mesas together. Sometimes we sat in the shade of the trading post directly across the street from the tracks. When the train rumbled through the small, dusty town near the reservation, it promised glamorous places far away. When I was 15 years old, I arrived alone in San Francisco with a guitar, a small suitcase, and $30. I went to several taverns and coffee houses in search of a job singing. I believed I could pursue a career as a performer. 3 days later, I found myself sleeping in a doorway to stay out of the rain that had fallen all day. I was broke and cold and had nowhere else to go. The only thing I had left was my pride, which prevented me from trying to reach my brother by phone or finding my way back to the people who never even knew me. Sometimes, in the middle of a long and restless night, a kind, middle-aged white man laid his hand on my shoulder. "Come on, young lady," he said. "Let's get you someplace warm and get you something to eat." The price he asked in return seemed little, considering the cold, rainy night behind me. I left his hotel with $50 in my hand. Thus began a long and somewhat profitable career in prostitution. After working all night, I would drink to forget what I had to do to pay the rent until the sunrise brought sleep. The weeks passed. I started stealing and robbed a gas station and a liquor store. I made very few friends. I had learned to trust no one. One night, around 8 o'clock, a car had pulled up to the curb just as I had settled myself, half drunk, against the wall of a building. I figured I had met my companion for the evening. We made the appropriate conversation to confirm the deal, and I got into the car. Suddenly, I felt a deafening blow to my temple. I was knocked senseless. In a desolate area across town, I was pulled from the car, pistol-whipped, and left to die in the mud, with rain falling softly upon me. I came to a hospital room with bars on the windows. I spent 7 weeks there, having repeated surgeries and barely recognizing my surroundings each time I woke up. Finally, when I was able to walk around a little, a policewoman came, and I was taken to the county jail. It was my third arrest in 2 months. Nearly 2 years on the streets had taken its toll. The judge said I could not be rehabilitated, and I was charged with 18 counts of felony. I would not see the streets again for nearly 26 months. I was 17 years old. The first few months, I would have done just about anything for a drink. I knew that I was powerless over the drugs, but I really couldn't see what harm there was in alcohol. In the summer I was released. I wasn't sure where I was going, but a nice cold beer sounded like a refreshing celebration of freedom. I bought a 6-pack and a bus ticket. When I got off the bus, I got a waitressing job at a bar. By the end of my first ship, however, I had enough money to get a bottle and a sleazy motel room nearby. A few weeks later I saw him, the only Indian I'd met in a long time. He was leaning over a pool table when I came to work. I put on my apron, grabbed a tray, and headed straight for him to see if he needed a refill. "Who let you off the reservation?" he asked. I was furious, humiliated, and embarrassed. That man became the father of my firstborn child. My relationship with him lasted only a few months. It was the first of many mutually abusive relationships that would continue over the next few years. I found myself alone, drunk, homeless, and pregnant. In a matter of weeks, I found that I would wind up back in jail. I went to live with my brother and sister-in-law. My brother had gotten a very good job and moved to Hawaii. My son was born there, and on the day of his birth, I found a purpose in life. I was born to be a mom. He was beautiful. Straight black hair and dark eyes. I had never felt like this in my life. I could put my past behind me once again and move forward into a new life with my child. After a year or so, I became bored with my life in the islands and the guy I'd been dating. I said goodbye to my waitress job and my family and moved to California with my 1-year-old son. I needed transportation, but cars cost too much money. Where could I get lots of money? It did not seem appropriate to go back to prostitution in the same town where I was raising my son. I could take the bus to the next town, work all night, and come home in the morning if I could get someone to watch my little boy. The night job paid well, as long as I didn't work close to home where my child would attend school. Everything would be fine. Also, I could drink on the job. I kept the welfare, though, because it provided health insurance. I did quite well financially. After 1 year, I found a beautiful large apartment that had a view of the ocean, bought a new car, and a purebred collie dog. The social workers started getting very nosy. I could not figure out what their problem was. I led a double life. By day, I was supermom. By night, I was a drunken hooker. I met a wonderful man on the beach, and we fell in love. Everything was like heaven on earth, until he asked where I worked. Of course I lied. I told him I worked for the government and held a top security clearance, which required complete secrecy. That's why I had to work nights, undercover, out of town, on weekends. Now maybe he would stop asking so many questions. But instead, he proposed. We moved in together, and my working arrangements became nearly impossible to live with. So did my conscience. One night, on my way to work, I sat in rush hour traffic on the freeway. I broke down in tears and felt all of the lies of my life burst open inside of me. I hated myself, and I wanted to die. I couldn't tell him the truth, but I couldn't continue to lie to him either. Suddenly, a great light came on. It was the best idea I ever got. I got off the freeway at the next ramp, drove home, and told him I got fired. He took it well, and we celebrated with a huge bottle of wine. It took a lot of booze to cover the nightmares of my past, but I was sure I could get around this small problem before long. I never did. The relationship broke up over my drinking, and I packed my little car and moved myself, my son, our dog, and 3 cats to the mountains. This mountain town was a place I had visited as a child with Dad and Grandpa. Memories of the stories of my childhood and our Indian people flooded in.
I got a job cleaning cabins for a local resort lodge and got back on welfare. Shortly after our move, my son started school. By this time, I was consuming nearly a fifth of tequila a day. Blackouts were occurring on a regular basis. One day, I got up as usual. The last thing I remember was feeling so shaky I could hardly stand up. I ate a tablespoon of honey, hoping it would give me the necessary sugar rush. The next conscious memory was from the emergency room. They said I was suffering from malnutrition. I was nearly 30 pounds underweight. They had the audacity to ask me how much I drank. What could that possibly have to do with anything? I promised I would never do it again. For the first time in my life, I tried very hard to quit drinking. After a few days of shakes and nausea, I decided that a shot of tequila wouldn't hurt. I had managed to put on a little weight, but 6 months later, I collapsed and was diagnosed with a bleeding ulcer. I was in the hospital for 4 days that time. They told me if I didn't stop drinking, I would probably die. My son called his grandparents, and they traveled to the mountains to visit. I had not seen them for years. We got along much better than I expected. The relationship they formed with my son was incredible. Dad took his grandson hiking in the wilderness, and Mom helped out looking after him while I worked. My health continued to fail. My parents wound up moving to our town in an attempt to get their grandson and me. My dad and I decided to go to a Native American gathering. I hadn't been to one of these powwows since I was a child. When we heard the drums and watched the dancers, I felt some great passion well up inside of me. I felt like an outsider. I wanted a drink. I wore my hair down to my waist and wore a lot of turquoise jewelry I'd collected over the years. I looked at the people, but I certainly didn't feel like one of them. I felt as if they all knew something I didn't. In an effort to prove I was getting better, I started hitting the streets again in order to make more money. I told my parents that I was going down the mountain to visit friends. I received my third arrest for drunk driving on one of the trips back. After working all weekend, the night in jail seemed a long time to go without a drink. Weeks and months passed, and the blackouts continued to get worse. Then I met a man in a local bar. I didn't like him very well, but he had quite a lot of money, and he sure liked me. He took me to nice restaurants and bought me expensive gifts. As long as I had a buzz on with a few drinks, I could tolerate him. One thing led to another, and we wound up married. The most powerful motive I had was getting out of the streets and being provided for. I had begun to think I did not have much longer to live. The faces of my doctors were looking more and more grim each time I went to the hospital to dry out. The marriage was a farce, and it didn't take long for this man to figure that out. Someone had told him about my past, and he demanded to know the truth. I was tired, nauseated, and drunk. I just didn't care anymore, so I admitted everything. We fought every day after that, and my visits to the hospital became more and more frequent. One afternoon, I decided I no longer wanted to live and got the gun from over the fireplace. I owe my life to the man I'd married. He heard my child scream out back and came running into the house. He grabbed the gun and wrestled it away from me. I was numb and couldn't figure out what had happened. My son was taken away from me by the authorities, and I was placed and locked in a ward for the criminally insane. I spent 3 days there on legal hold. After I was released, most of the next few weeks was a blur. One night, I caught my husband with another woman. We fought, and I followed him in my car and tried to run him down, right in the middle of the main street in town. The incident caused a 6-car pileup, and when the law caught up with me later, I was sent to the locked ward again. I do not remember arriving there, and when I woke up, I did not know where I was. I was tied to a table with restraints around my wrists and both ankles, and my neck. They shot heavy drugs into my veins and kept me like that for a long time. I was released 5 days later. When I left, there was no one there to drive me home, so I hitchhiked. The house was dark and locked, and no one was anywhere around to let me in. I got a bottle, sat in the snow on the back porch, and drank. One day I decided I'd better go to the laundromat and wash some clothes. There was a woman there with a couple of kids. She moved around quickly, folding clothes and stacking them neatly in a couple of huge baskets. Where did she get her energy? Suddenly, I realized I had to put my clothes into the dryers. I couldn't remember which washers I had them in. I looked probably into 20 different washers, and I made up my mind how to handle the situation. I would stay here until everyone else had left. I would keep whatever clothes were left behind, as well as my own. The other woman finished her tasks. She was writing something down on a small piece of paper. She loaded her baskets and kids into the car, came back into the laundromat. She came right up to me and handed me the small blue paper. I couldn't make out what it said. I smiled politely and slurred a thank you. Later, I made out the telephone number and the handwritten message below. If you ever want to stop drinking, call Alcoholics Anonymous. 24 hours a day. Why had she given me this note? And what made her think I was drinking? Couldn't she see that the bottle I was drinking was just soda? Of all the nerve, I was mortified. I folded the paper neatly and put it in the back pocket of my jeans. As the next few days passed, I became sicker. One morning, I woke up alone, as usual. I hadn't seen my husband in a long time. I needed a drink, and the bottle on the bedside table was dry. I rose on my shaky legs, but they refused to hold my weight. I fell to the floor and began crawling around the house, looking for a bottle. Nothing. This meant I had to leave the house and get to a store. I found my empty purse on the floor, but I knew I would never make it to the car. I became terrified. Who would I call? I never saw friends anymore, and there was no way I could call family. I remembered the number in my pocket of my jeans. I hadn't even gotten dressed for several days. Where were my jeans? I searched the house until I found them on the floor of the bedroom. The number was in the pocket. After 3 tries, I managed to dial the number. A woman's voice answered. I got this from you. Is this AA? I asked. Yes.
Do you want to stop drinking? Please, yes, I need help. Oh, God. I felt the fiery tears run down my face. 5 minutes later, she pulled into my driveway. She must have been some kind of angel. How had she appeared from nowhere that day in a laundromat? How had she known? How had I kept her number all that time without losing it? The AA woman made sure I had no more alcohol in the house. She was very tough on me for a long time. I went to meetings every day and started taking the steps. The first step showed me that I was powerless over alcohol and anything else that threatened my sobriety or muddled my thinking. Alcohol was only a symptom of a much deeper problems of dishonesty and denial. Now it was a matter of coming to grips with a power greater than myself. That was very hard for me. How could all these white people even begin to think they could understand me? So they brought a sober Indian woman up to work with me for a day. That was a very powerful day. That Indian woman cut me no slack at all. I will never forget her. She convinced me I was not unique. She said these white folks were the best thing that ever happened to me. Where would you be without them? She asked. What are the alternatives? Have you got any better ideas for yourself? How many Indians do you know who are going to help you sober up? At the time, I couldn't think of any. I surrendered behind the tears of no answers and decided to do it their way. I found the power greater than myself to be the magic above all the heads of the people in the meetings. I chose to call that great magic spirit. The 12 steps worked like a crowbar, prying into my dishonesty and my fear. I didn't like the things I learned about myself, but I sure didn't want to go back where I came from. I found out that there was no substance on the planet that could help me get honest. I would do just about anything to avoid working on myself. That thing that kept me sober until I got a grip on honesty was the love in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I made some friends for the first time in my life, real friends that cared, even when I was broke and feeling desperate. At 22 months of sobriety, I was finally able to complete an honest inventory. The fifth step enabled me to see my part in my resentments and fears. In the chapter, How It Works, in the big book, I was shown some questions. The answer to these questions provided me with knowledge about my reactions to the conditions in my life. Every response to every resentment, real or imagined, had been sick and self-destructive. I was allowing others to control my sense of well-being and my behavior. I came to understand that the behavior, opinion, and thoughts of others were none of my business. The only business I was to be concerned with was my own. I asked my higher power to remove from me everything that stood in the way of my usefulness to him and others, and to help me build a new life. I met my current husband in an AA meeting. Together, we carry the message to Indian people on reservations all over the country. I started at the fifth grade level in school when I had been sober nearly 2 years. After college, I started my own business. Today, I publish the books I write. Our daughter was born during my early sobriety, and she is in high school now. She has never seen her mother take a drink. Our family has returned to the spirituality of our ancestors. We attend sweat lodges and other ancient ceremonies with our people, our sovereign native land. We take panels of sober, natives into Indian boarding schools and institutions and share about recovery. My life is filled with honesty today. Every action, word, and prayer, 12-step call, is an investment in my spiritual freedom and fulfillment. I am in love and proud to be a Native American. At an AA meeting on an Indian reservation, I heard the words, "Sobriety is traditional." I stand at the top of the sacred mountain and I listen to the wind. I have a conscious daily contact with my Creator today, and He loves me. Everything is sacred as a result of the 12 steps and the love and recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. Chapter 5, Twice Gifted. Diagnosed with cirrhosis, this sick alcoholic got sobriety, plus a life-saving liver transplant. Today is Sunday, my favorite day of the week. Things are usually peaceful, and I always get that wonderfully humbling, it's amazing to be alive feeling. I am happy to say that very few days go by without that feeling. Sunday used to be pretty wild in the old days. That is what I call my drinking days. The old days. It was the last day of the weekend, finishing up a few days of partying with my friends. I never went anywhere that was not a party, and if in doubt about the occasion, I'd think of a good one and bring the party with me. I cannot remember a time without booze in my life. Even when I was young and didn't drink myself, liquor was always around. I do remember a time at the beginning of my drinking, thinking to myself that I was not and would never become an alcoholic, knowing in a very personal way exactly how an alcoholic lived. I was a teenager then, and I figured I was just having fun. I could control everything about my drinking. By the time I actually reached legal drinking age, I had definitely gone beyond the weekend party drinking, and Sunday once again became the first day of the week, soon to become a week of daily drinking. During my young adulthood, drinking was the way I related to others. I did not know anyone who did not drink, and all of my interests, friendships, and more intimate relationships revolved completely around drinking. Over the years, by all appearances, I grew up and got a life, but it was only a facade. I never did mature other than the physical way. I appeared normal on the outside, but I knew I drank, and so did everyone else. But I behaved pretty well, and only by chance managed to stay out of harm's way, except for a few occasions. Looking back now, the picture of my life before I got sober looks like a long series of unfinished matters. Through the years, I had quit on everything that mattered: college, going for promotions, relationships, at least the relationships that demanded any work. Then a few things began to change. Some years before I finally gave up drinking, my body started to give me signals that continuing on this course might not be as carefree as it had seemed up to that point. When stomach problems began, I visited a doctor, and when queried about my drinking habits, I glossed over the idea that I overindulged. Tests were run, but no real diagnosis was ever confirmed. I was advised to maintain a healthy diet and watch alcoholic intake, along with other prudent suggestions from the doctor. I was still young and thought to myself that I was just giving my body a break by slowing down. Would allow me to bounce back. Over the next few years, I had quite a few episodes of feeling sick, and of course, having never attended to the real problem, my drinking was still escalating. When my symptoms started to multiply, I finally had to consider the real possibility that drinking was the cause of all the health problems. For brief moments, I somehow realized that giving up the booze was probably in my future. With what realization came fear and so many questions. How will I live? What will I do with my life? Certainly, a life without booze meant I would not have fun. And surely I would not be fun. Up until the moment I realized I might have to give up drinking, I had believed I was perfectly happy. I had a fine life, a good job, nice place to live, a car, friends, all the things I thought I needed in life. Ideas of getting help to quit drinking had surfaced, but were fleeting. It never grew into anything like reaching out. My health had finally taken a serious turn for the worst. I was frequently unable to get out of bed, even to go to work, and strange new problems were exhibiting themselves with regularity. I resolved to divorce myself from the bottle, but trying to stop alone was disastrous. During the dry periods, I was very weak and sick. Then at times I would drink. It was out of control. I would isolate and binge. Those last drunks ended in episodes of uncontrolled shaking, dry heaves, and even hallucinations. At the end, I was scared and suffering, and I felt as though I were absolutely alone in the world. A series of circumstances brought me to a new doctor. I had to see a doctor because, once again, I had become fearfully ill, and I was unable to work. My stomach was distended, my ankles were swollen, nearly twice the normal size due to fluid retention. The whites of my eyes had yellowed from jaundice. I had spidery broken veins all over my body. My skin itched all over and took on an eerie greenish gray appearance. My blood had apparently thinned, because the lightest touch would cause a terrible bruise, and even a small scratch would bleed for a very long time. Dark marks appeared on my face and arms. My hair began to fall out, and because I had no appetite at all, I was very weak, extremely fatigued. The new physician took one look at my appearance and my blood tests and asked if I drank. I said that I used to, but had abstained for quite a while. This was a blatant lie. In reality, the only person who was being fooled was me. My doctor explained that I had a disease called cirrhosis of the liver, but how far it had progressed was hard to tell. But by the symptoms I was having and the results of my test, the disease seems fairly advanced. The picture he painted was very bleak, and as the disease worsened, I would become sicker, weaker. Finally, there would be a slow and painful progression usually ending in a fatal episode of bleeding into the stomach, or lapsing into a coma and death. With that, he referred me to a special clinic, not an ordinary group of doctors, but a liver transplant clinic. The initial interview with this group of doctors made it clear that if I wanted to live, I was going to have to prove that alcohol was no longer going to be part of my life. I was 37 years old at the time, a relatively young woman for what was happening to my body. I was suddenly afraid of dying, and I was desperate. I had attended AA meetings prior to that time, but the words of the doctors had somehow, finally, began to clear the way. At the meeting that first night, more of what people in AA were saying started to pass through my ears and into my head, finally into my heart. The members of Alcoholics Anonymous offered me a gift of life. I found myself willing, and after some weeks of just showing up, I began to believe that this program could work for me. The next 6 months were spent in AA, meetings every single day, at least one, sometimes 2 or 3. I found a wonderful patient sponsor who helped me to work the steps and practice the principles. During the 6 months of evaluation by the clinic, I was given a blood test at least weekly, sometimes randomly, to validate that I was not drinking. I had weekly meetings with a psychiatrist on the transplant team. My family members attended some of those meetings, and the doctor, who also had contact with my sponsor. Another mandate was that I enter some type of psychotherapy with a professional, either group or individual sessions. This too was not something I would have chosen for myself, but it has turned out to be a very positive force in my life. At the time of the evaluation, there had to be evidence that I was doing everything possible to assure continued sobriety. After a 6-month period, I was finally listed as a candidate for liver transplant. By the time my name was placed on the transplant list, I had become very sick. My liver had progressively continued to shut down, and the official wait had really just begun. I had no way of knowing how long it would be before a suitable organ would become available, or how long it would be before I rose to the top of the list. At times I felt resentful of the selection process, the tests, the close supervision of my AA program, and the seemingly endless wait. Unquestionably, it was only because of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I was able to let go of that resentment. I actually found an abundance of peace and serenity during those months preceding the surgery. And after 6 months, I was given a second chance and a second gift of life. The surgery itself was a wonderful success, and my recuperation was unmarked by setbacks. Some years have passed, and as I look back from the clarity of this moment, I know that the way here for me could not have been by an easier path. I would not willingly have stopped the course of my life was on. I needed harsh reality to see the damage that alcohol abuse causes. In so many ways, I needed to be forced into acceptance and humility. My physical being has certainly undergone a transformation, but the major transformation has been spiritual. The hopelessness has been replaced by abundant hope and sincere faith. The people of Alcoholics Anonymous have provided a haven where, if I remain aware and keep my mind quiet enough. My higher power leads me to amazing realizations. I find joy in my daily life, in being of service, and simply being. I have found I have found rooms full of wonderful people. And for me, each and every one of the big book's promises have come true. The things that I have learned from my own experience, from the big book, and from my friends in AA. Patience, acceptance, honesty, humility, and true faith in a power greater than myself are the tools I use today to live my life, this precious life. Today, my life is filled with miracles, big and small, not one of which would ever have come to pass had I not found the door to Alcoholics Anonymous. Chapter 6, Building a New Life. Hallucinating and restrained by sheriff's deputies and hospital staff, this once happy man received an unexpected gift from God, a firm foundation in sobriety that would help hold up through good times and bad. We had been in the fields all day, baling hay. When the work was done, the men brought out a gallon of muscatel. I took a few drinks because I wanted to be like the men, and for a few minutes I felt like one of them. Then I fell asleep under the outdoor table where my mother fed the workers. When I was found, they carried me into bed. And the next day, I got a scolding. I was 6 years old. My early years were spent on my aunt and uncle's farm. They raised me after their father and their mother divorced. My father kept my 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and my grandmother took me, the baby, and when raising a baby was too much for her, I ended up on the farm. Life was hard work in those days. We ate what we grew for ourselves, plus the few store items we traded for. And by age 8, I was guiding a horse-drawn plow by myself. In the family and in our farming community, we spoke only Spanish. It wasn't until I went to school that I was forced to speak English and was told that speaking Spanish wasn't right. I never felt I was smarter as the other kids or as good as anyone else. On the farm, I knew I could do anything. In school, it was a different story. At 13, I was tall, strong, and looked older. My aunt and uncle had sent me to live with a family in a larger town to get schooling they hoped would help me. I went around with guys who were 18, and they took me to a Halloween party. I almost choked on the first sip of whiskey they were passing around, but by the second sip, I thought it was pretty good stuff. It made me feel like one of the guys. It didn't matter that I was only 13. I felt just as old as they were. By the end of the night, I'd passed out in an outhouse and had to be carried home by a friend. By 15, picking produce in the summer to earn money, I was sneaking out nightly to drink beer in the fields with the other pickers. Primed with beer, I could talk to girls, go to dances. I was just like everyone else. I could enjoy the day. I was the equal of others, even if they were older. The next summer, I began working construction during school vacation. I was working with the older men, and at the end of the day, I went to the bar with them. The bartender would put the beer in front of the man next to me, but it was intended for me. I love Fridays. Payday. When we got out, we got loaded. I started getting liquor on the weekends so I could go to dances. I was hanging around with guys who drank like me. We'd put our money together to get enough booze for the night, and because I looked older, I bought the liquor. I could talk to the girls, and I was a big shot with the guys because I had the booze and the girls. 2 days before Christmas, I was on the way to basic training. On the train's last stop, my buddies from home and I got off and rushed to the bar to buy liquor to celebrate Christmas. Back on the train, they were warned that the MPs were throwing bottles out the window. So we drank ours hard and fast. We got loaded. After basic, we were sent to different bases. I didn't drink often because I wanted to get ahead. But every time I drank, I wouldn't stop until everything was gone. I didn't know how to say I'm going to quit now. At home on leave, I married a young woman from my home, and our first daughter was born the next year. When I came home from the Air Force soon after that, the party really started. A big hero like me, but I drank only on weekends at first, drinking and dancing with my old buddies and their wives. The only car accident I had was while drunk, and that happened that year. It was a hit and run on a parked car, and my buddy just pulled the car's fender off the front of my car and we kept driving. The next morning we looked in the paper to see if the accident was mentioned. It wasn't, and we were never found out. The same construction company I'd worked for in the summers as a high school hired me as an apprentice carpenter. I was smart and learned fast. Then I got too smart and forgot all the company had done for me. I complained to them about money I thought they had promised, and they fired me. Using the GI Bill, I went to the mechanic school at night and got a job with the guys. That's when I really started drinking. These guys had a ritual. As soon as they got to work, they bought a bottle of wine. At first, I didn't participate. I didn't drink wine. Not a tough guy like me. But then one day I decided I might as well drink. I had a couple and I liked it. For the next 5 years, I drank every day. I was finally injured on the job and sent home for a week, but I was supposed to call in every day. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was drunk all day. On the fourth day, the boss come to my house to check on me. I wasn't there, but I returned drunk before they left. They didn't say anything about me, but the next day the union leader told me I was going to get fired. I went to the city hall and resigned. 3 more daughters had been born to my wife and me during those years. I was filled with remorse, guilt, and fear because I didn't have a job. I knew I had screwed up. There was no unemployment then. To my mind, it was bad luck, not me. I took whatever construction work I could get, even non-union, whatever there was. My firstborn son and my second son 2 years later. I had recovered my pride and wondered why I should make all of this money for other people. I thought I should become a contractor and make it for myself, so I took the exam and got my license. I curtailed my drinking a little bit, and the business started getting good. So I started drinking more. I'd go to the bar and leave my crews working by themselves. By the third year, I spent all my time in bars. I couldn't finish the jobs I had. I'd spent all the money. I was in bad shape. I was a full-blown alcoholic, blaming God and bad luck. He had me down. I just couldn't get back up. I lost my business. For the next 3 years, I was working odd jobs. 2 days here, 3 days there. I was barely making it with a family to support. I didn't bring home enough, and I drank it all up. I didn't bring home enough. I just drank it up. My wife was griping and cussing, and I just wanted to get away from it all. I started taking jobs out of town. One time, I was a foreman for an aluminum siding company. I don't know how we got jobs finished. Every morning I was hungover, sick. The workers would have to wait for me to start. At noon, I'd go to the bar to fix myself up, and then I'd party all night. There was only fighting at home, and I finally moved out so the kids wouldn't see me drunk. Now I can really drink, I thought. My wife went on welfare, and I even stopped contributing after a while. I had to have enough to drink. I continued to work construction, but I wasn't very dependable. I'd work okay for 3 or 4 weeks, and then I wouldn't want to get up in the morning. I'll get another job, I think, but I always got fired. A few years later, I was arrested, driving while intoxicated, but it was reduced to reckless driving with the help of a state police buddy of mine's. It was told, however, that if I had one more offense, they would take my license away. That was at the same time as my first try at AA. I couldn't get sober, and I couldn't get drunk. I was feeling scared, remorseful, guilty. I ran to the hamburger stand near my apartment, looked in a phone book for the number of a clubhouse of AAs, gave them a call. 2 men came to my apartment, stayed with me, drinking coffee until after the bars closed. They kept coming, taking me to meetings for a month. I thought I was doing okay, so I didn't need it anymore. I felt like those 2 guys after me bothered me so much. So I got drunk to get back at them. After I moved to California, my kids were on the welfare while I was touring all over. I never knew anyone could make the money I made in union construction jobs in California, so I drank it up. I didn't feel bad about the kids because I was drunk all the time. I sent them presents. When I got sober, I felt bad about them, so I drank again. I couldn't stand being sober because I couldn't stand thinking about how I hadn't taken care of my own kids. I did a lot of drinking on the job. Carpenters worked in shorts and had coolers of beer. There were beer cans all over the job site. I would go to the all-night store early every morning to buy a bottle of wine for my thermos, just to keep me going till lunch. Then I'd buy some wine at lunch for the afternoon, and on my way home, I'd purchase a 6-pack of beer and another bottle of wine for my evening. That was the cycle of my life. Once I was stopped because my truck was weaving. while I was driving home from a friend's house. They gave me a DWI. It meant a $300 fine and a year of probation. And I didn't think I would make it, so I decided to move back home. He spent 3 months of unemployment, which to me meant 3 months of partying. When the money ran out, I looked for a job, even though my California Union card meant nothing. I got a job as a foreman back with my first employer. I look back on that now and I think, was God good to me or what? And I was blaming God all this time for my troubles. Since it was my first job in 3 months, I celebrated staying drunk. I'd go to the job site and get the worker set up and then take off and drink. This lasted until the day I told off the owner of the company we were working for, and I got fired. That job put me on the union hiring list. However, I got good jobs with good companies. I began to try to get sober. Sometimes I'd last for a week or two. Then I'd get drunk again. I was seeing the kids a lot then. I moved into the apartment behind my wife's house, sharing it with my father-in-law. My daughters were married by then, and my sons were in junior high. I wasn't included in family events, but I was there. That year, I went to an alcohol treatment program twice. The first time, I was in treatment. I was shaving at the mirror in the bathroom, and it seemed to me that my beard was growing back and fast as I could shave it off. Even though I was in a hospital gown, I escaped, running down the streets, jumping over fences. I was on the porch of a woman's house, banging on the door for her to let me in when the cops arrived. I tried to convince them she was my wife and my children were inside. They saw the hospital bracelet on my wrist, and they took me back to the program. Those were the days when you were strapped down to protect you when you went into DTs. They were the worst DTs I'd ever experienced. I had never been so scared in my life. I thought gangsters were after me, and they were going to try to kill me. They had me tied down, so I tried to be very quiet and hide so they wouldn't find me. The doctor told me that if I went into DTs like that again, I might not come out. I stayed sober 3 months after that experience, going to some AA meetings. Then I drank again. A few months later, I was back in the treatment program. Not as sick this time. So I stayed sober for 3 more months. Then I went on a 10-day binge. I was filled with fear and I couldn't walk. Eventually, I had to crawl to make it to the bathroom. I eventually cleaned myself up and managed to get to work. Then a Thanksgiving Day party on the job started me back drinking every day through Christmas. I was laid off after that. Then I got really down to some serious drinking. By mid-January, I was having hallucinations that would not go away. I called a residential treatment program and said, I want help. They told me I could be admitted in 3 days. I drank to maintain for those 3 days. Amazingly, I knew that once I got into the program, my drinking would be over. One of my daughters drove me to the program and helped me fill out the paperwork. I almost fell down going into the building. My hallucinations began again, and the staff moved me to a room with a padded floor they called the TV room. I began to think I was in prison and these guys were trying to kill me. When they opened the door to that room, I ran for the window in the hall, thinking I could escape. They grabbed me, afraid I would try to jump through it. I kept hitting my shoulder against the wall, trying to break out, and picked at nails with my fingertips until they were raw. The staff called the sheriff's department, and it took 3 deputies, 2 counselors, and 2 nurses to hold me down and give me a shot. Finally, I laid there quietly, ready to die like a man. It was 3 days later when I woke up, naked and stinking. They cleaned me up and I felt great. I'd never felt so good. Heck, I felt like I'd never had a drink. I went to the treatment sessions and listened to everything they said. They took us out to AA meetings. I wanted what the AAs had. I don't think I ever wanted anything as much as I wanted the program. I saw men dressed in suits those days, looking good. That's how I wanted to be. I thought of doing some crazy things, but never thought about taking a drink. To me, sobriety is a gift from God to me. If I drank, it would be giving the gift back. If you return a gift, the person takes it back, right? If God takes it back, I'm dead. In my first year in AA, I was going to at least 7 meetings a week. I just loved it. I dressed up in suits, like all the men I had seen. I went to work, building a mall, and there was an AA member working there who had had 8 years of sobriety. We would share together every day. I know now God put that guy there for me. During that year, I was offered a job with the city and one with a construction company out of town. My sponsor counseled me to stay where I had the support of my group and my AA friends. I was too young in the program for an adventure. I went to the city, and now I'm retired from there. A guy like me, with one employer for 18 years. Once I was sober, my wife took me back, and I felt that I had to go back to take care of the kids. I had also once left on welfare. Our third son is our AA baby. I also go to see lots of our boys play sports. There were also other AAs with kids on the team, and we thought we would hang around together at the games. I really enjoyed myself. My sobriety baby is now in college. I have beautiful relationships with all of my kids. Pushed by my sponsor, I got into service work right away, and I've really enjoyed it. Now I'm a general service representative of a Spanish speaking group, learning how to express myself about this great gift of sobriety in my original language. There have been some hard times too during these years of sobriety. When I was 5 years sober, the daughter who drove me to treatment, helped me get admitted, disappeared. My AA friends helped me search for her, but she has never been found. Her mother and I raised 3 daughters. I did not have to take a drink. I went to lots of meetings to relieve the pain. When I lost a second daughter to cancer a few years ago, I did the same thing. What I've learned is that it doesn't matter what hardships and losses I've endured in my sobriety. I haven't had to go back to drinking as long as I work the program. Keep being of service, going to meetings, and keeping my spiritual life together. I can live a decent life. When I look back now, I think I stopped maturing at 15 when I started to get drunk with the older guys. I wanted to feel at peace with myself and comfortable with the other people. I never found it in drinking. The belonging I always wanted, I found in AA and in sobriety. I don't think about drinking. God is there. My sponsor is there. All the credit belongs to God. On my own, I could not have quit. I know. I tried it. Chapter 7. On the Move. Working on the AA program showed this alcoholic how to get from geographics to gratitude. I thought my life had come to an end when I arrived at my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. At 28 years old, I had been drinking since my early teens, and to my way of thinking, booze had been the answer to all of my problems, not the problem itself. Even I had to admit, though, life had gotten pretty bad, and my opinions and options were quickly running out. In a moment of desperation, I agreed to go to one AA meeting. It is easier to see now, as I look back on my drinking days, that from the very beginning, alcohol had been a part of nearly every disaster in my life. As a very young boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, I'd begun to steal drinks when my parents were not looking, or my friends, and I would convince someone from the local high school to buy us some beer. Slowly, but very steadily, my problems began to grow from there. It started with simple episodes at school. My buddies and I would split a 6-pack over lunch and thought no one would notice. It never occurred to me that a 13-year-old could simply not hide the effects of even a single beer. By the time I was 14 or 15, things were getting far more serious, and the consequences of my drinking were getting more and more costly in every single way. Socially, morally, financially. A turning point came when I was 15. My mom was in the middle of an ugly divorce. Through no one's fault but my own, I decided that I had the answer. In a drunken brawl, having planned every step of my actions, I attempted to kill my stepfather. I vaguely remember being dragged out of the house by the police and yet again, trying to answer for what I had done while drunk. The results were that I eventually was given a choice by the judge. Go to juvenile hall until I was 25 years old, or leave the state until at least 21. I did not want to go to juvenile hall, so I did the math and decided the better part of valor was to get as far away from there as I could. Over the next 13 years, until I graced the doors of AA for the first time. Life never really got any better. I did, however, learn the fine art of geographics. From my home on the East Coast, I landed in Japan. Then I moved back to the United States and to New England. Then out to California, where over the next 6 years I saw my alcoholism take me to new depths of disgrace, embarrassment, and despair. As one of my early AA sponsors used to say, I didn't hang out with lower companions. I became one. The specifics are pretty much the same for most alcoholics. The places I used to swear I would never go, I went. I did things I could not imagine myself doing. I hung out with people that at one time I would cross the street to avoid. There came a time when, looking into the mirror, I honestly did not know just who was looking back at me. To say that I had arrived at the jumping off point is an understatement. Life just simply could not go on like this very much longer. I began the process of speeding up the day life would end. My doctor has 6 or 7 suicide attempts on my medical records. Most were pitiful efforts to reach out for help, although I didn't see it at the time. My last such attempt was very public and demonstrated that I had lost touch with reality in any sense of what my actions could do to others. A friend took pity on me, I think, and invited me to his home for Thanksgiving. His parents were in town from the East Coast, and he was having a big party. There, at the dinner table, I stood up and attempted suicide in front of everyone. The memory of that has always stuck in my mind as the definition of pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization that the big book talks about. What is sadder is that my actions had made sense to me at the time. As a result of that episode, I ended up seeing a psychiatrist to find out what was wrong with me. At our very first session, she invited me to tell me about yourself. I proceeded to do so, only to be told to stop after I had spoken for only 5 minutes. She explained that she really had only 2 things to say to me, that she thought I hadn't told the truth since I walked into the office, and that I was an alcoholic. It took me a long time to understand how a description of my life could make anyone think I was a drunk. The doctor had said that if I was going to continue to see her, I had to agree to do 2 things. First, she gave me a business card with a phone number on it. She said the next time I tried to kill myself, I should call that number first. Second, she was going to give me a book to read, and she wanted me to read the first few 100 pages before our next meeting. Before I left that day, she gave me a copy of the big book. It took me some time, but I eventually made it to my first meeting. I had gone out on New Year's Eve. When I came to, I thought it was the next morning. As I held my head steady, I popped some aspirin and tried to drink a cup of coffee. I glanced at the front page of the news. It was January 9th, and I had been in a blackout for over a week. After everything else that had happened, that was terrifying enough to get me to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. When I drove up to that first meeting, though, I saw the address. I had actually a church. As a nice Jewish boy, I was not about to wander into the church. I knew that I would not be welcome. I hid on the floorboards of the car and peeked out the window, waiting for the drunks to walk by. Everyone looked normal, so I figured I might be in the wrong place. I was about to leave, but then I saw a drinking buddy of mine go by. I jumped out of my car and greeted him. Funny thing, but it was the first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous also. What a coincidence. In we walked, into a world that has turned everything in my life inside out. I didn't like AA and the people in it for a long time. I didn't trust anyone, and I got tired of sitting in the meetings listening to other newcomers as they began to talk of finding God, having their families return to them, being treated with respect by society, and finding some peace of mind. It never occurred to me that they had sponsors and were working the 12 steps of recovery. I had what I now call a sponsor of the month. I always had a sponsor, but whenever one of them would lovingly suggest I do something, I would fire them and move on to someone else. I remained angry, bitter, and isolated, even though I was going to 5 or 6 AA meetings a week and not drinking. At 7 months sober, I was getting a little bored with AA and began to wonder if this was all there was to life. The concept of not drinking ever again seemed a little extreme, and I thought that perhaps it would be different this time. Then something happened that I now believed helped me to stay sober and find my higher power. I woke up one morning and I couldn't feel my legs. I could still walk with a little difficulty, but it got worse as time passed. Several months and lots of medical examinations, doctors, hospital visits, and tests later, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The past since then has been quite a journey, and now either walk with crutches or use a wheelchair. There have been lots of times I wanted and intended to drink again. During my second year of sobriety, I slowly became angrier and angrier. I was in what one of my sponsors now refers to as the angry years. I was one of those people we see at the meetings and wonder how they stay sober. At my home group, members did not give up on me. They loved me anyway. One day, the group's general service representative announced she was moving and would have to give up her commitment, and they elected me to her job. They explained to me that a serious 2-year service commitment was exactly what I needed. I tried to explain that I was not eligible, but they told me to go to the monthly general service business meeting and tell them my problems with serving. Needless to say, they didn't allow me to quit either. Along the way, I learned, in spite of myself, that the best thing about AA service jobs is that for a period of time, I got out of myself. At some point, I began to shut my mouth and actually listen to what other people were saying at meetings. After white-knuckling it for almost 2 years in AA, I finally broke down and saw that I could not stay sober all by myself. But I was terrified of going back to drinking. After all my suicide attempts, I had no fear of dying, but I could not stand the idea that I would go back to living that way again. I was at what the old-timers in our literature refer to as a jumping off point. I didn't know what to do. One evening, I did the unimaginable, at least for me. After picking up my sponsor of the month to go to a meeting, I informed him that I was ready to work the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In most respects, my life began again that night. That man took me through